Life seems perfect. You fall in love, get married, and live a lavish life in San Diego, California. You feel safe at home, unaware that someone has been watching, patiently waiting to strike. It won't be revealed who they are until 40 years have passed. Today's case brings us to beautiful Southern California, specifically La Jolla, California. And it's not Lala, it's La Jolla. If you speak Spanish, let me know if it's true that it translates to the jewel. No one is quite sure who or what inspired the name, but the origin of the name La Jolla is disputed by residents and historians. Some believe that the city's name came from an Indian term, which meant hole in the mountains. Nevertheless, it's one of California's most popular beach destinations because it is just breathtaking. The oceanfront views. La Jolla is in San Diego, and it lives up to its nickname of the Jewel due to its natural beauty, its various activities, and its luxury lifestyle. Since 1900, La Jolla's population has increased significantly from its initial 350 residents. After the soldiers returned from World War II, many of them flocked to La Jolla with their families, and new houses had to be built quickly as the old horse trails were paved. Sprawling communities arose on the mountain slopes. Over 50,000 people lived in La Jolla by 1960, and there are currently over 40,000 residents living there today. It's still considered a very small, close-knit community. Today, La Jolla boasts over 200 sunny days, more than 100,000 merchants, and 101 restaurants. It's also home to nearly 300 seals and sea lions. The popularity of La Jolla as a seaside destination attracts wildlife enthusiasts, beachgoers, surfers, divers, and sea lovers. In 1978, CBS News 8 described La Jolla in an article highlighting the area as the good life. Although the town of La Jolla was praised for its coastline, shopping, and restaurants, only 1 year later, in 1979, it would be shaken by a brutal, senseless murder. Now that I've set the stage for where this case takes place, I'd like to introduce you to the Beckers, Michael and Barbara, and their two young sons, aged 9 and 7. Barbara Ruth Pepper was born on October 21, 1941, in Pennsylvania, where she met the man of her dreams who would become her husband, Michael Becker. Michael graduated with a master's degree from the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania in 1965, and within a year, he completed his internship in internal medicine at Barnes Hospital at Washington University Medical Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Michael and Barbara moved to San Diego, California in 1970, where Michael worked as a rheumatology fellow at the University of California, San Diego, and at the VA hospital. Barbara and Michael had two sons, whom they loved very much. They were Barbara's world. Barbara was an upstanding member of her community. She was very active, athletic, and very pretty. She would attend local events, watch her son's soccer games, and was fully dedicated to being a housewife and a stay-at-home mom to her boys. She was always running around doing errands, and anytime anyone saw her, they would see her with a smile on her face. She even played on a football team with other women from her husband's hospital where he worked. She loved life, especially her life, and she had a very good life. She and Michael lived in a very affluent neighborhood, kind of off the beaten path, and they were able to afford this home, which is now estimated at $4 million, because Michael Becker was a prominent UC San Diego medical professor and doctor. The neighborhood they lived in was close to UC San Diego and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I want you to take a look at this house. I don't know if it was different back when Michael and Barbara were living in it, but look at it now. It is big, with lots of windows. Who knows if these hedges were here before? I do know there were hedges, I just don't know if they were this tall, but it's got a big yard, it's on this nice corner lot with a lot of space, and it has a 2-car garage here on the left side and a couple of ways to access the home from the street. The neighborhood has a few dead ends, you can see them here. There are 3, and a major road leading into this is Torrey Pines Road. It is a very residential area, and the Beckers' home is to the back, close to this dead end, also close to this big area out back full of nature, as far as the eye can see, until you get to the aquarium where all that underwater wildlife lives. See their house off Burrow Avenue and Glenwick Lane? right there on the corner. There are several homes right in front and around their house. Like most of us, the Beckers had a routine. Every weekday morning, the boys would take the bus to school, and every afternoon, they would take the bus home. Dr. Becker would go to work at the Veterans Hospital, and Barbara would run errands, carry out daily housework, meet with friends, make lunch for the boys, then prepare dinner when Michael came home, and the routine would repeat itself. They knew what to expect, except when things didn't go as planned. On Wednesday, March 21, 1979, the morning began as usual, with the boys heading off to school and Dr. Becker going to work at the VA hospital, which was only 5 minutes away from their home. Barbara stayed home, doing her normal everyday chores and housework. It was when Barbara's 2 young sons came home that the Becker family's normal routine was shattered. The boys returned from school at 1:30 in the afternoon. They usually entered the house through the side garage door, expecting it to be unlocked as usual, so they could walk right in and be greeted by their mother. Except this time, the door was locked. They looked over and saw their mom's Volvo station wagon parked in the driveway, which usually meant she was home. It was unusual that the door would be locked. So, they decided to walk to the front door, hoping that Barbara had accidentally locked the side door but left the front door unlocked for them. After trying the knob on the front door, they were in luck. It was unlocked. The 2 boys entered the house, but it turned out it wasn't luck, it was absolute devastation. That afternoon, these poor little boys witnessed something that no one should ever have to see, a sight that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had expected their mother to greet them, but it was silent inside. Their normally active mother was not running towards them with open arms, asking about their day. Instead, as the boys entered the living room, they stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. They found their mother's body lying lifeless on the floor, with blood all around her. No one can be certain if these young boys knew exactly what they had just seen, but they knew enough to realize that something horrific had happened to their mother. They immediately ran out of the house, screaming for help. They banged on a neighbor's door until they got a response. Once the little boys calmed down enough, they were able to explain to the neighbor what they had found in their home. The neighbor called the San Diego Police Department, who sent out patrol officers, as they were the closest to the home at the time. Now, it can be frustrating to hear how this case played out because we're talking about the late 70s here. The way police departments handled murder cases was much different back then. And that's why I actually find these cases so interesting. It's fascinating to see how far techniques and technology have come. But these patrol officers who were first on the scene had gathered as much information as they could from dispatch and entered Barbara Becker's house on Glenwood Lane through that unlocked front door that her boys had entered. Their job was to make sure that this was not an active situation, that no perpetrator was inside the home, then secure this as a crime scene, setting up things like crime scene tape, things of that nature. The neighbor who called the police had actually gone inside Barbara's home. They wanted to understand what the boys had related to them. But once the patrol officers had arrived, everyone was out of the house. This is an example of the layout of the home. When you come through that front entryway, the living room was off to the left. The kitchen is right here to the right of that, followed by a family room and then the garage. To the right of the entryway was a long hallway. It consisted of a bedroom on the right of that hall, with a dining room on the left. As you move further down, there was a den on the left, a bathroom on the right, followed by a couple of bedrooms towards the end of the hall, including the master bedroom. Initially, when the officers saw the scene, they thought that Barbara had taken her own life, but after a closer inspection, it was apparent that someone else had done this to her. When I say done this, it wasn't exactly obvious what had happened. There was just a lot of blood. It was everywhere, and there were obvious signs of a struggle. They soon realized they needed to alert the homicide department. They knew they were going to need everything at that scene to be preserved. So they stopped, turned around, and waited for the homicide investigators to arrive. When this crime occurred, the San Diego Police Department only had 4 homicide investigators, but these men were diligent and they followed procedures to the T. Upon their arrival, they walked through this affluent M. Hoya home while observing the crime scene. All 4 investigators moved in a single file line. This was protocol back then. It may still be used today, I'm not sure, but walking in a single file line ensured that no evidence was touched that could later prove to be helpful to them. It meant less trampling over evidence or creating shoe impressions where there shouldn't be. Yes, there would be some contamination, it's inevitable, but they tried their very best to contain it to a very small area, as small as possible. This wasn't the day and age when they used shoe covers or high-tech PPE. It was just one foot in front of the other. Before they even came across Barbara's body, they could tell a struggle ensued by the fact that a small table was overturned and missing one of its legs. The house that Barbara kept was very organized and tidy, so when things were out of place, they definitely stood out. You can see the table right here, and it's definitely out of place. Investigators finally reached Barbara. She was lying on her back in the living room. She was close to a television that investigators determined should not have been on the floor, another sign that there was an altercation between her and the assailant. Even without seeing a weapon at this time, they knew that this was a stabbing death. It was apparent from the massive amount of blood underneath Barbara on the carpeted floor and from the wounds left on her body. As they got closer, it was even more heartbreaking. The sheer amount of violence that had to have happened here stunned these veteran officers. Barbara was fully clothed. Her clothing did not appear to be torn or ripped, and what that signified was that, at that point, they didn't believe that this was a sexually motivated crime. She did have visible stab wounds on various parts of her body, and investigators knew that Barbara fought hard for her life. She had a number of defensive wounds. So what happened? Who would have brutally stabbed a stay-at-home mom in a quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood? And not just stabbed, but slayed this woman? And I want to get into more of that during the review of the autopsy report. But at this moment, detectives were still conducting a walkthrough to document everything that they could see and photograph as much as possible. The crime scene would never look like this again. It's important to do a thorough walkthrough to make sure nothing is left out when it comes to documenting everything that they saw. I do have some pictures to show you of what the scene looked like, but let me explain what they were seeing first. Most notably, they saw a kitchen knife. It was about 10 feet away from Barbara's body. I feel like we don't see this as much anymore with the advances in technology. I think it's way less common for a killer to leave the murder weapon behind, and it appeared as if the person who did this was walking away with it and then decided to drop it as they walked out of the living room and away from Barbara's body. It was located on the carpet next to the sofa, and there was blood on both the handle and the blade. The thing is, there was a blood trail going into other areas of this home, and the investigators deduced that this trail could not have been made by Barbara. They don't think that the knife was still in the killer's hands, dripping blood onto the carpet as they walked away. So, this meant the killer must have been injured, and that it was their blood being left behind. Cutting oneself in the commission of a stabbing is very common. Blood is slippery, and with the force necessary to make such impactful wounds, many times the killer loses grip and the knife slips, and they cut themselves, especially when they use something like a kitchen knife with a sleek handle with no traction. They most were not wearing gloves for that extra grip either. From where they're standing, investigators can see a trail of blood leading from the living room to the left into the kitchen. There are blood droplets on the floor, and there are also smears on the countertops and other areas all over the kitchen. They also noted that the dishwasher was wide open. You can see it here. This may have been where the knife was retrieved, or Barbara may have been possibly getting ready to unload it when the attacker came inside. It definitely appeared that the attacker was trying to stop their blood and maybe wrap up their injured arm or hand. There was a bloody towel on the kitchen table, and in the sink, there was a wet, bloody paper towel that was thrown on a cooking pot. There were blood smears all over the sink area as well. The trail continued into the bathroom, which was down the hall adjacent to the kitchen. Even more blood droplets were found on the floor in there, as well as bloody toilet paper on the floor. They were most likely trying to stop the bleeding before this person fled. There was bloody toilet paper in the toilet as well, which was unflushed, and blood covering the sink. Every bloody tissue and paper towel investigators believe the suspect touched was preserved and saved as evidence, but it wasn't processed or analyzed the same way it would be today, which is very interesting to me. With these older cases, it was so much harder to figure out who committed a crime like this unless you had an eyewitness. It's fascinating to me that the blood was collected to conduct a blood test, and I'm talking about the ones you get at a doctor's office to determine what blood type you are. I was in awe over this, and this was the biggest lead you could get when it came to blood evidence, or DNA, if you will. I have more to say about this, but there was no way for them to match DNA to an actual person back then. It was only to determine the blood type, so that if and when they did get a potential suspect, they could take that person's blood and then rule them out if they didn't have the same blood type. That's not really that great when it comes to pinpointing the actual perpetrator, but it's what they had at the time. After the detectives walked the scene and observed each room and documented their findings, they reconvened to talk about potential motives. One thing they agreed on was that because of the amount of blood at the crime scene and the number of wounds on Barbara, the person who did this wanted to ensure that she was dead. That was the goal before they left the house. But why? Well, there were theories. They believed the suspect, ECT, was a male, and even narrowed it down to a white male, just because of the statistics they had at the time. This was one, possibly a burglar gone wrong. Maybe someone cased the neighborhood. They knew everyone's schedule. They knew Barbara was going to be alone during the work days, and that the kids were at school. So they thought this was the perfect opportunity to strike, but maybe they weren't aware of how strong and fierce Barbara would be. She's 37 years old and active, and it might have caught him off guard when she fought back. He met her with a fight, and it escalated until he grabbed a knife and ended Barbara's life. Or two, it could be that someone was stalking Barbara instead of casing the house to commit a robbery. Perhaps it was Barbara that they were after. They could have snuck in from the open side door that the boys usually used, grabbed a knife, threatened Barbara with it, and as they tried to force themselves on her, she resisted. That's what made this assailant fight back, and ultimately, he cornered her in that living room, where he ended up ending her life. The third theory was that this was just a very deranged person, full of rage, who was on some kind of killing frenzy. They were just out for blood, and Barbara was an easy target because she was a female alone in her home with an unlocked door. Regardless of the theories, they had limited time. They needed to get moving. Back in those days, the first 24 to 48 hours were even more important than they are now. Their evidence could be walking away, and someone could have seen something, and they might lose the opportunity to talk to them. With only 4 detectives on this case, they divided the workload. Each one of them had their own duties. One would be responsible for taking notes and photos and working more with the crime scene. Another would canvass the neighborhood. Another would notify and interview family and friends. And the last of the 4 would correspond with headquarters. But they would all work together and reconvene at the end of the day to share information. It's just so crazy to think that there were no cell phones back then, that nobody could have caught the assailant on video. Even video surveillance, I don't know if it was slim to none. I mean, there weren't Ring cameras. There weren't doors that officers could go to and say, "Hey, can we see the footage from today?" That just didn't exist. Their best bet was that someone saw something out of the ordinary and would remember seeing it. But I will say, back then, people didn't have as many distractions, like scrolling social media all day, for example. So they did have more time and an opportunity to have their eyes open and see something. At this point, investigators can't rule out any possibilities. They have to follow each tip and each lead carefully to see where they lead them. The San Diego Police Department had one of the highest murder solve rates in the nation in 1979. so they assumed that Barbara's murder would be another easy slam dunk for them. Back then, like I said, that first 48 hours was even more critical. During the first 2 days following a crime, investigators worked on nothing but that case for 2 days straight. Sometimes they wouldn't even sleep. The more information an investigator can gather after a murder, the better chance they have of catching their suspect, because eyewitness statements will be fresh in their minds. No matter how low the police department's resources were, homicide investigations were taken very seriously. One terrifying aspect of this case is that the killer was on the loose. There could be a serial killer about to take their next victim. Investigators knew that once they began to canvass this neighborhood, all of the residents would be aware that a murder took place, and word would travel fast. This would inject fear into the community and put more pressure on the already taxed law enforcement agency. The detective tasked with conducting the canvass went door to door, asking anyone if they heard anything, if they saw anything out of the ordinary in the day or the days leading up to the murder. Investigators were kind of intrigued by the fact that the murderer would have chosen this area. It was tranquil. It was off the main roads, not easily accessible for through traffic. There had to be intent to drive into this area. It wasn't like you would accidentally find yourself lost within it. The only people who would normally be walking around or driving down these streets were the residents. The typical crime in this area was usually petty burglary or a drunk driver. Nothing had been as horrific or brutal as what happened to Barbara Becker. Not that anyone working this case could recall anyway. All the residents were stunned. It did not seem real. The detective was getting more questions than answers because everyone he talked to wanted to know what happened. Investigators contacted every single neighbor on every street in that neighborhood and received just a few tips that seemed even remotely promising. One witness told investigators they saw a person who looked like a housekeeper, and she was visiting several houses in the area. Another neighbor reported seeing landscapers that were cutting Barbara's bushes in the days before her death, along with a crew of workers. So a number of people were there. These were both really good leads. Perhaps this woman that they saw going door to door was casing the neighborhood, or maybe someone who was cutting the grass at Barbara's became obsessed with her. Next, they had to track down these individuals for questioning. Meanwhile, another detective's job was to notify Barbara's family, but he also sought out to interview anyone close to her because most violent crimes, especially ones like this, are committed by someone the victim knew, someone close to them, someone with a reason to harm them. The first call they made was to Barbara's husband. He was at work when they called him, and he was made aware of what was going on by default. He's also their #1 suspect right now. When they informed him of what occurred, his emotions were raw. He wanted to know how it happened. He actually hung up on them and raced home to be with his wife. However, when he arrived on the scene, he was met by the detectives, and he cooperated. They asked him about everything he did that day, starting from that morning. Dr. Michael Becker told investigators that he left his house somewhere around 8:20 in the morning to drive one of his sons to school. They both usually rode their bikes together, but that morning, Michael took one of them himself before heading into work at the hospital. Kind of peculiar, but okay. He said after he dropped off his son at school, he headed back to the hospital to work, and he was there all day long until their call. He's actually the head of one of the entire departments at the hospital, so it was going to be pretty easy to verify his alibi if it were true. He also told them that Barbara had told him she had a hair appointment at 10 o'clock that morning. At that point, the detectives had to get personal with Michael. One of the biggest reasons that someone's wife is killed is usually because of a domestic issue. So, even though this is an upstanding doctor in the community, detectives want to know, and they ask point blank whether Michael or his wife were sleeping with other people or if they were in an unhappy marriage. He says no. He said he and Barbara were very happy, there were no issues in their marriage, and he had nothing to do with this. He was devastated. He was shocked by this news, and it was obvious to investigators. They do use their gut feelings to gauge whether or not someone's guilty or innocent, but it felt like when they were trying to gauge his reaction that he was innocent. They believed him. They still had to check his alibi. After all, he was only a short drive away. There wasn't GPS tracking on a cell phone to know his exact movements. He could have dropped his son off, gone back to the house, killed his wife, and then gone to work all day. Or could he have left work sometime during the day? Anything is possible. Investigators went into the hospital and talked to his colleagues, and they were able to confirm Michael's story. He was at work by 9 o'clock, and he was seeing patients back to back all day. He was never seen leaving the hospital at any time. Furthermore, none of his colleagues said that they ever witnessed anything that would make them believe that there were any marital issues in regard to the Beckers. The crime scene was still being processed, and the leads from the neighborhood canvas were being followed up on. Meanwhile, the autopsy report was completed immediately following the investigators' thorough inspection of the house. The coroner arrived to preserve Barbara's body before she was transferred to the medical examiner's office. The coroner covered Barbara's hands and feet with plastic bags to save fibers or skin from under her fingernails. This is crucial when someone fights back. Even if it's not apparent visually speaking, there could be evidence that cannot be seen with the naked eye underneath the fingernails. They don't want any of that to fall off, so the hands are securely bagged for transport. The medical examiner performed an autopsy on Barbara's body just a day after her murder. One of the 4 investigators from the San Diego Police Department was there to observe this entire examination. He was taking notes and photographs of her entire body. During Barbara's autopsy, horrific details were revealed. The medical examiner identified 8 stab wounds to Barbara's throat. Her murderer attempted to use the dull kitchen knife as a saw. There were 7 back-and-forth strokes on her neck that reached her backbone, and that's heartbreaking. Barbara also had wounds on the sides of her head, which were so deep that her skull was showing, and some of the most horrific injuries were actually on her hands and fingers. They were sliced to the bone as her murderer was swiping that knife at her. Barbara was trying to shield herself, but to no avail. She was no match for that blade. Barbara's cause of death was determined to be what is known as exsanguination, extreme blood loss. Consequently, the manner of death was classified as homicide, which is pretty obvious to all of us, but they have to make these findings official. As those 48 hours were coming to a close, the crime scene was still being scoured. Investigators also tracked down the men who were working on Barbara's home, trimming her hedges, and all of them cooperated with investigators and were cleared of any suspicion. They also confirmed that the woman seen going door to door was a housekeeper for a family in La Jolla, and her husband routinely drove her to work and dropped her off, so they were both cleared as well. Now, back at the crime scene during this time, investigators were not collecting blood evidence and DNA evidence because they would use it to detect the suspect. That was way off. That was a long time from happening. Instead, the investigators and law enforcement officers would focus on fibers, fingerprints, and hair evidence, and the blood, like I said, would be collected to type the blood. Laboratory technicians analyzed all the blood stains and the clothing that Barbara wore for any hairs, fibers, or trace evidence collected by investigators at this crime scene. As much evidence as possible was collected and preserved in case a suspect appeared, so that one day they could match it to him. But without another set of fingerprints, you can't match fingerprints. Without a person's blood type, you can't match the blood type. And without a person's hair, you can't match the hair. So all of this is pretty useless at this point. They still had to preserve it. Even though they had the killer's blood in 1979, they couldn't do much with it. The lack of DNA testing at the time made typing the blood the only option. Forensic blood typing works as follows. If the blood at the crime scene is type A, then anyone with, let's say, type O negative, like me, would be excluded as a suspect. If the blood found at the crime scene was type O negative, then anyone with that blood would be a suspect. But that would mean 40% of the population. Although it wasn't as good as DNA testing, it was all these investigators had at the time. I can't even imagine because it sounds so silly now that we know the capabilities we have now. Even though the process could strongly link a suspect to the crime, it couldn't prove guilt. In most cases, the method was used by law enforcement to eliminate suspects from a crime instead of pinpointing them, because that would be obvious. Like I said, if the blood type was A and you are type O negative, you're probably not the killer, right? You're not the killer. In an article published by the Los Angeles Times in May of 1979, the San Diego Police Department expressed their confusion over the decrease in domestic homicides. So instead of a husband killing a wife, something else was happening. Before 1979, there were many crimes of passion, and law enforcement would respond to these areas. There were partners killing each other, and when they arrived, there was pretty much a smoking gun, literally. It was easy for law enforcement to solve these types of crimes, because there you had it, the husband with a knife in his hand, the husband with a gun in his hand. But starting in 1979, these cases were getting even more complex, and they only got worse with time. Most of their unsolved cases, like that of Barbara Becker's murder, were crimes committed by a stranger, which made them difficult to resolve. Only one murder committed between January and May of 1979 was classified as a crime of passion. They also reported increased sexual-related crimes and robberies against women that escalated to murder. What was going on back then? I'm not sure, but the residents of La Jolla were terrified that a serial killer might be roaming their community. California was a hot spot for serial killers around the 1970s. Serial killers roaming the Golden State in the 1970s included the following, and some of these will be familiar to you. This will be a little bit of serial killer trivia, if you will. Angelo Buono and his adopted cousin Kenneth Bianchi were known as the Hillside Stranglers, and I hope I'm saying those names right. I'm probably not. They were convicted of killing 10 young women in Los Angeles between October 1977 and February 1978. I'm going to just put all of their names up on the screen. This is just so heartbreaking. They were between the ages of 15 and 28 years old. The two men would persuade their victims that they were undercover cops and then order them to get inside their Cadillac, which they claimed was an unmarked police car. Then they would drive them home, torture them, and murder them. Next on the list is Ed Kemper. You've probably heard of him before. His nickname is the Co-Ed Killer. He is so scary. He murdered a total of 10 people, including a 15-year-old girl as well as his own mother and her best friend, from May 1972 to April 1973. This was following his parole for murdering his paternal grandparents. Yes, he was only 15. He was sitting at the kitchen table when he got into a fight with his grandma, as children usually do with their elders. But little Ed was not normal. He ran off and got a rifle that he was supposed to be using for hunting, but he had been using it to shoot small animals in the neighborhood, so it was taken away from him. He knew where it was, and he got it. He stormed into that kitchen, pointed it at his nan, and pulled the trigger. That's just so heartbreaking. It was said that her last words were, "Oh, you better not be shooting the birds again," and unfortunately, he wasn't. When his granddad arrived home, he met him in the driveway and shot him as well. That is unbelievable to think that he was actually let out after that and went on to kill 8 more people, all women. He would pick up female students who were hitchhiking and take them to an isolated area where he would take their lives in many different ways that I cannot mention here, and then take them back to his home and have his way with them. Next up is Rodney Alcala, also known as the dating game killer. He was convicted of 5 murders committed in the state of California between 1977 and 1979. He received an additional sentence of 25 years to life after pleading guilty to 2 additional homicides committed in New York. While he was conclusively linked to 8 murders altogether, the true number of his victims remains unknown, and they think that it can be much higher, around 30. He was known to have a collection of more than 1,000 photographs of teens, young women, and boys, many in very explicit poses. It was believed that he would toy with his victims, play with them like toys, and asphyxiate them until they passed out, and then play with them again. It reminds me of Dahmer, even with the pictures. Rodney was dubbed the dating game killer because he actually appeared on a television show in 1978 called The Dating Game, and this was right in the middle of his murder spree. That's unreal to me. Last, I have to mention one of the most infamous, Joseph James D'Angelo. That name may not ring a bell, but how about the Golden State Killer? I bet you've heard of him before, right? That's Joseph James D'Angelo. He committed at least 13 murders, 51 instances of forcible rape, and 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout California, and each one of them gave him a different nickname. When he was in the San Joaquin Valley, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, before moving into the Sacramento area, where he became known as the East Area Rapist. Then, committing serial murders in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange County, he was known as the Night Stalker, later the original Night Stalker because Richard Ramirez was also called the Night Stalker. He was caught with the help of a crime writer named Michelle McNamara, and if you haven't read the book or seen the documentary called I'll Be Gone in the Dark, it's a must. I do not want to give away what happens if you haven't seen it, but it was the first case to be solved using genetic genealogy, which, by the way, has become a buzzword lately with the University of Idaho murder case. We don't even have actual concrete press releases or official documents mentioning that this was utilized at all. Yes, news stations have said it. Yes, people on Twitter have said it. But instead, all this probable cause affidavit mentioned was the good old parental DNA. But this is for another day. Yes, all of these serial killers that I just mentioned could have committed Barbara Becker's murder, but investigators could not find any evidence linking them to her crime. The investigation turned cold despite all of their best efforts. Unlike some other investigators, the San Diego Police Department wasn't one to let cold cases remain unsolved. They would revisit Barbara's investigation files all the time to see if there was anything they could do to solve it. An excellent and dedicated team of homicide investigators was involved in this investigation. So, despite working on all these other murder cases, they would still drive to La Jolla and speak to Barbara's neighbors. They were hoping that someone would give them new information. Nevertheless, no one could ever recall anything that would lead these homicide investigators to a suspect. To check on the status of Barbara's investigation, her family contacted the homicide division every year or two for updates. Barbara's brother wrote letters all the time to investigators, but Barbara's husband, Michael, could not talk to them. He was still emotional, which is to be expected. However, of course, he eventually remarried and became a prominent rheumatologist who was responsible for extensive research into gout, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and how our genes affect those diseases. In the years that passed after Barbara Becker was murdered, she was always on the minds of the homicide investigators at the San Diego Police Department. She should have been safe. She was in her home. And if technology caught up, there was a potential to solve this case with the advancement of DNA technology. Investigators would test the DNA found at Barbara Becker's crime scene in hopes of finding a suspect. And things started to look up because in the 1990s, CODIS was established. We hear the word CODIS all the time, and I always forget what it stands for, but it's the Combined DNA Index System. It's the FBI's criminal justice DNA database, and it contains DNA profiles contributed by federal and state laboratories. The computer software operates local, state, and national databases of DNA profiles of convicted offenders, as well as unsolved crime scene evidence and missing persons, all throughout the 50 states. So there is a lot in this CODIS system. It also automatically generates investigative leads, and it uses 2 indexes, the Convicted Offender Index and the Forensic Evidence Index, which both include biological evidence that is recovered from a crime scene. I know that sounded like a lot. It is very technical. It is science after all. But the DNA profiles of those convicted of crimes range from misdemeanors to murder, and they are contained in this database. A DNA profile is submitted by an investigator, and then it's automatically compared with anyone in the CODIS computer software. By matching profiles in this forensic index, crime scenes can be linked together, and that's how we can identify serial killers. The computer system does it for us. We don't have to sit there poring over documents trying to make links anymore. An investigator may be able to identify a suspect based on a match made between the forensic index and the convicted offender index. The CODIS system had many advantages for law enforcement, such as taking DNA samples immediately after arrest, rather than waiting for a conviction. Having DNA on file speeds up the investigation process. You can identify the suspects faster, and you can prevent innocent people from being wrongly convicted. If we did this more often and collected DNA upon arrest, and it isn't done everywhere, this would eliminate those who are innocent immediately. It would save more time and money because these faster identifications lead to a shorter investigation and quicker outcomes for victims and their families. However, like I said, not all states do this. A lot of times you don't get your DNA taken unless you are convicted. But things are changing. A lot is changing. However, CODIS came with some disadvantages, including incomplete DNA samples, which can be mistaken for someone else's DNA. Even so, at the time of Barbara Becker's cold case, they were willing to accept the method's slight disadvantages. Since CODIS was established, the San Diego Police Department started closing criminal cases like crazy. They were matching DNA from older cases with DNA of newly convicted felons. I feel like it's one of the best inventions when it comes to crime solving. The DNA profile of an unknown male was found in the blood in Barbara Becker's kitchen and in the bathroom, and that was submitted to CODIS. But once again, despite all of these efforts, they did not get a hit. Therefore, they feared they would never be able to provide Barbara's loved ones with the answers that they deserved. If this person had not committed another crime since Barbara's murder, they wouldn't be in the database, since it did not exist at the time of the crime. So anything he did before Barbara's murder would not have a way to have been recorded. However, let's jump to April of 2018, because new DNA technology profoundly impacted the criminal justice system, and the world was hearing about it, like we still are right now, because we are in it. They heard about it because of a significant arrest in California. We just discussed this one. The following years of diligent and dedicated investigation, the Golden State serial killer was finally apprehended on April 24, 2018. This man was a former Navy veteran, a former police officer, and a father. We should all know his real name by now, Joseph James D'Angelo. After several decades of eluding the police and taunting them, how did the investigators finally identify this murderer? Well, the cold case investigators used a revolutionary technology I told you about, forensic genetic genealogy. Since September 2021, forensic genetic genealogy has uncovered over 100 murder and other criminal suspects and identified many Jane and John Does. These are victims without names. They went without names for so long. Now here's my chance to set the record straight about genetic genealogy, because it's complicated and it's being thrown around a lot in the media lately. Many people are misunderstanding what it is, and I understand it's truly hard to wrap my brain around it. But I truly try hard to understand things and get them right, so I hope I'm helping. Please pass it on after I explain. It's thought that our DNA is able to be used to solve crimes, and that is incorrect. Now you know that is not true. It is entirely illegal and a severe breach of privacy for any agency to take our DNA that's been submitted to these private companies and use it to match to an unsolved case. It would be great in some ways if these databases would open up for this DNA to be used for that purpose. For example, there are 12 million people that have submitted their DNA to 23andMe, including myself. Many people believe that using this DNA from these online databases violates their privacy rights, but strict rules have been established to protect us, to protect the public, especially when it comes to law enforcement. This can all be found on the 23andMe site. This is how 23andMe responds to law enforcement requests for customer information. It says, respect for customer privacy and transparency are the core principles that guide 23andMe's approach to responding to legal requests and maintaining customer trust. We will closely scrutinize all law enforcement requests, and we will only comply with court orders, subpoenas, search warrants, or other requests that we determine are legally valid. To date, we have not released any customer information to law enforcement. So, There you go. Now let me explain the truth. There are only two databases that openly allow authorities administrative access to run matches, and they are the genealogical databases, GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. I'm going to say it again. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA provide genetic genealogy's investigative power. Now here's the thing, on GEDmatch, users can upload their DNA from any direct-to-consumer company such as Ancestry or 23andMe. So this is where I think it gets confusing. If you submit your DNA to 23andMe, you can get your raw data. I've done it. You can put that raw data into other databases, and you can put that into GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA if you want to be part of this revolutionary way to solve crimes. This innovative method of finding suspects is a lot easier now, thanks to the rise in consumer DNA products that I just mentioned. Now wait, let me go back because I want to explain what genetic genealogy is first, real fast. The word genealogy relates to studying or tracing the lines of family descent continuously from one ancestor. So when you see someone build out a family tree, they are mapping out genealogy. Wikipedia had an easy-to-understand definition of genealogy. It's the study of families, family history, and tracing of their lineages. Genealogists use oral interviews, historical records, genetic analysis, and other records to obtain information about a family and then try to find the kinship and pedigrees of its members. So, with that being said, you do not need DNA to make a family tree, and you usually don't have the DNA to create it. Professional genealogists use methods to trace back ancestry. They use many methods that I just mentioned. However, combining those techniques with one of the ancestors or relatives' DNA can speed up the process and make it more accurate. We're getting closer to the combined definition here of genetic genealogy, I promise, but it combines that genetic factor. Genes are what make us who we are, and our genes are made of DNA. So therefore, if we take the DNA from a crime scene and there's no matching CODIS, meaning this person has never committed a prior offense, we used to be at a loss. But now, with GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA databases, this unknown DNA can be run through all of the known DNA of all those individuals who decided to submit their DNA for this purpose. This opens up the door to partial DNA matches against this unknown sample at the crime scene. There are limitations, and I will explain. Currently, there are 1.45 million people in GEDmatch, and in Family Tree DNA, there's almost 1 million people. That's not even close to the power of 23andMe, but it's a lot better than having no one to compare this unknown DNA to, right? So when they put it into these databases, there's a potential to find a partial, maybe not even a partial, a slight match with someone somewhere that has some of the same DNA as the suspect. But it's usually someone related at a far greater distance, meaning a fifth cousin, not a father. It's not an easy task. If you do get this partial match, you're still clueless about how it connects to the suspect, and that's where the genealogy comes in. Now, these professionals who know how to make those family trees use this one person as their starting point. Then they begin to build out that family tree and deduce who this unknown individual can be. Let's say they get a family tree down to 5 male individuals, and they look at all their ages. Let's say there's one in their 20s, but the crime was committed 40 years ago. They're ruled out. They go back to the family tree to find someone older, eventually possibly finding someone that they think matches the age. That's when they start to research that person. Where did they live at the time of the crime? How old were they? Did they know the victim? It isn't easy because there's a lot of legwork to still be done on a case. But wait, just wait. Now that you have an idea of how this works, let's go back to Barbara's case. The Cold Case Unit decided to work on investigations within the San Diego Police Department that they believed had enough DNA evidence preserved from way back when to use investigative genetic genealogy. So investigators searched through binders and binders, looking for specific cases that had a lot of DNA left behind by the suspect. In particular, they were specifically looking at stabbing cases, because that's when a perpetrator has more likelihood of cutting themselves during an attack, leaving behind their blood. As these cold case investigators were going through these binders, they found Barbara Becker's binder, and they were shocked at how much DNA evidence was still preserved. Thankfully, those investigators were so diligent, 4 men, that's their whole team, and they were able to diligently preserve this. So the cold case unit pulls Barbara Becker's file, examines all the blood stains found in the bathroom and the kitchen, and it had all been blood typed. It was confirmed to be male. Barbara, the victim, was female, so they determined that the unknown male blood belonged to the killer. They decided that this case had so much potential to be solved using genetic genealogy. Until the Golden State Killer was caught, Barbara's murderer had been on the run for almost 40 years. They thought that it was about time to give her family some answers, if they could. So they uploaded this DNA profile from Barbara's crime scene to GEDmatch. Their goal was to identify a distant cousin of the suspect, and then build out the family tree. Then investigators would research the family to see if anyone was in the San Diego La Jolla area when Barbara was murdered in 1979. Before law enforcement can even access GEDmatch to search for a relative, they have to prove that they have exhausted all other investigative methods, such as CODIS, without success. Just so you know, in order for authorities to do this, they cannot do it secretly. They always have to present themselves as law enforcement, and they can only compare genetic markers. They cannot check for things like psychological risks or genetic diseases. That's off limits. I'm so glad that this exists and that it's being used the way it is, because to think that someone came into Barbara's home and did such an awful thing to her and just left to go about their normal life is just unfathomable to me. I don't understand how someone could be so heartless and just move on like nothing happened. When the suspect's DNA was entered into the database, it was determined that his ancestry was French-Canadian. This posed somewhat of an issue because these are American databases, so his family tree would be close to impossible to build out. However, over the decades, the French-Canadian family actually married into American families. Luckily, the suspect shared a little bit, just some of DNA, with a family whose last name was Chartrand. So they began building out this family tree, and finally, they had someone that seemed to match up. His name was Paul Jean Chartrand. But how did they figure this out? It honestly seems like witchcraft, but rest assured it is a science and investigative work. When they ran Paul's name for a background check, they found out he was living in San Diego when Barbara was murdered. Not only that, he owned a business in La Jolla, so that is a major lead. They aren't just picking anyone off this family tree, they have to make it make sense. He owned a carpet cleaning company a mere 3/4 of a mile away from Barbara's home, and Paul was out on bail awaiting trial for a charge for him forcing himself on a woman. This was around the time that Barbara was killed. This was enough for them to look deeper into who Paul was. They found out that Paul Jean Chartrand was born October 21, 1951, in Montreal, Canada, but he made his way to the United States. They were able to track down his ex-wife and 2 biological sons, who were currently living in Southern California. His family confirmed that he was living in San Diego at the time of Barbara's murder in 1979. As they looked deeper into his past, they found out he was a convicted offender, and you probably know what kind I'm talking about. I told you what he was out on bail for. Before they tracked him down to obtain a sample of his DNA to test it against their suspects, the investigators wanted to put together as much information as possible, including his potential motive. Since Paul was a sexual deviant, investigators decided this might be the motive for the murder. Maybe Barbara entered the carpet cleaning store as a customer, or she could have just been walking around in this neighborhood, shopping, doing her daily routine, and she caught his eye. There were not that many people living there, so it could be a very likely scenario. Then, this killer most likely followed Barbara, maybe even stalked her for some time, before finally he couldn't take it anymore, and he had to go one step further and carry out his dark fantasy. They believe he entered Barbara's house that March afternoon to kill her. They think he probably entered the house as she was getting ready for her hair appointment. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen, snuck up on her. But that's not to say that Barbara did anything wrong at all. This man chose to come inside a home that did not belong to him and to act out a disgusting crime. Paul's adult sons wanted to assist in the investigation, and other relatives of Paul were also very willing to help in any way they could. One of his sons graciously spoke to investigators, and they told him they thought it was his dad who committed Barbara's murder. They were shocked when his son replied that he was pretty sure his father was the killer. He told them that his father was mean, and as a child, Paul's son said that Paul would throw him against walls in their house. At this point, investigators were confident that they had their suspect. Their suspicions were confirmed once they compared the DNA profile found at the crime scene to that of Paul's son. It was a direct match. Exactly 40 years to the day after Barbara's murder, investigators found her killer. Paul would have been close to 30 at the time that he killed Barbara. This is what he looks like. And honestly, to me, he's just so unassuming. He even smiles in his photos. I wouldn't expect someone that looks like that to have done something like this. But there's an issue with making an arrest and getting Paul's DNA. His family gives them the bad news. Paul died in 1995. But this is just so disappointing because you want justice for what Paul did to Barbara. Paul died August 13, 1995, in Arizona at 43 years old. He had moved to Arizona right after Barbara's murder, and when he was out on bail, his bail was so low, it was just unjustified, especially for what he did. Barbara may still be alive today if he had been in jail back in 1979, like he should have been. However, they still will never know why Paul did what he did. They couldn't ask him, and they couldn't figure out why he would choose Barbara. The investigators finally contacted Barbara's husband to share the bittersweet news, and Dr. Becker appreciated the efforts that the San Diego Police Department put forth. After he informed his two sons and Barbara's brother about the information, he asked the media to please give them space and time. I actually could not find any of their names, so they really did honor their wishes. They did feel relieved that Barbara's killer was dead, since no one thought they could face this man who murdered her if they had to go to trial. A few days before the news was released that Barbara's murderer had been identified 40 years after her death, investigators contacted Paul's family. They appreciated the tip from law enforcement. The family was horrified to learn that Paul had been involved in a crime of this magnitude. The investigators who closed Barbara's case described his family as wonderful and helpful people. So I wanted you to remember this. So many times, we want to place blame on the family of a suspect or a killer, and rightfully so. They're the flesh and blood of this person who took someone's life. But the parents and children of a suspect or a killer are not responsible. They can't control what their relatives do, and usually they have no connection to their crimes whatsoever. It's devastating for them to know that their loved one was responsible for something like this, and they have to grieve as well. At the time of the press announcement that Paul was Barbara's killer, many of the homicide investigators who worked on her murder case over the years, 4 decades later, were retired, including Gary Gleon. But they were thrilled when they heard the news, and they were surprised because this Paul person had never been on their radar. They were commended for all their hard work in preserving and saving the evidence that was later used to give closure to Barbara's family 40 years later. And they should be very proud of what they did in her case. Investigators would not have been able to solve this crime without genetic genealogy. It is a vital tool, and it's going to be even more vital. The process is minimally intrusive to all the parties except the offender, and to think about how many cases it can be used to solve in the future. Investigators hope that they can provide other families with answers using genetic genealogy. Just back in 2009, there were several cold cases that were solved using genetic genealogy, including Barbara's. But there was Scott Martinez's family. They received answers in 2019 after he was repeatedly stabbed with a sword back in 2006. And it certainly will not be the last time that investigators strive to bring answers to families by using this technology. I am so sorry to Barbara's family, especially her 2 young sons. I hope that they were able to find joy in their lives despite such a horrific tragedy. I wanted to point out that it's been said, as I stated, that the suspect in custody right now connected to the University of Idaho case was found using genetic genealogy, but it's never been officially reported anywhere. Instead, in the probable cause affidavit, It explains that a single source of male DNA was recovered from a knife sheath that was found next to one of the victims, Maddie Mogan. That DNA was put through CODIS, and there was no match. However, they had ring camera footage of a white Hyundai Elantra speeding away from the scene at approximately 4:25 a.m., following the time that they believed the murders occurred. And they noticed it didn't have a front license plate. So when they were doing their investigation into all the white Elantras in that area, they got a hit on one of them that was involved in a traffic stop back in August, and it was registered in Pennsylvania at the time. Well, in the state of Pennsylvania, they do not require a front license plate, and that was a big clue. They tracked down the person listed on that traffic stop. His name was Brian Kohberger. He lived less than 10 miles away from where the murders took place. So far, this is not genetic genealogy, it's just investigative work. Then, they obtained cell phone records and were able to pinpoint that his cell phone pinged off towers in the area of the murder at various times in the late hours of the night into the early morning hours, at least 12 times, before the murder. Suspiciously, it did not ping there when the murders were being committed, but it pinged at a tower close to Brian's apartment. Then it seemed to be shut off or in airplane mode, but then it starts to ping again after the murders, leaving the area of the crime. This is what truly led them to Brian as a potential suspect. They merely confirmed his identity with a parental DNA test through his father's DNA that they retrieved from the family's home back in the Poconos. When they tracked Brian's movements across the country right before Christmas, they tested items from the trash can, and that DNA matched at a 99.9% probability as being the father of the unknown DNA that they got from the crime scene. Brian is the only son in the Kohberger family, so that's not genetic genealogy, it's a paternity test, if you will. I just wanted to clear that up. Not to say that there wasn't any genetic genealogy that they did in the case prior to testing Brian's father's DNA, but I hope that helped, along with all the information that I laid out about how this whole process works. Now maybe you can add your own 2 cents online when people drop the method of genetic genealogy. For many young girls, the dream is to grow up, become a princess, and live happily ever after. Christine Johnson was no different, but she had ambition that set her apart. Everyone knew she was destined for greatness. They imagined her name in lights, but no one could have foreseen that she'd be remembered not for her dreams, but because of a monster with a dark and twisted plan. This is her story. Today's case happened right here in Los Angeles, and when I heard about it, I could imagine all of the locations being mentioned because I had been to many of them before. It's another really twisted case that could really happen to anyone. Christine Louise Johnson was born on February 22nd. Christine Louise Johnson was born on February 22nd, 1981 in Santa Clara, California, to her mother and father Teresa, who goes by Terry, and Kirk Johnson. Before she was even out of diapers, the family moved from California to the small town of Saugatuck, Michigan. It's like night and day, going from a busy city to a quiet resort town with a population of only about 1,000 people. It's a picturesque town. It's ideal to grow up in. It's nestled comfortably along the shimmering shores of Lake Michigan, embodying the quintessential small-town lifestyle. Serene, secure, and close-knit. It's the type of place where roots run deep, houses and cars are perpetually unlocked, and evening bike rides are untroubled by safety concerns. At the heart of this community is an unspoken understanding that everyone knows everyone, and people grow close to their neighbors. It's also a very popular vacation spot during the summer when people flock to its sandy beaches for that small-town charm. It was where the Johnson family called home. It's where Terry rocked little Christine, whom they called Christine, to sleep every night, sometimes singing to her. One of her favorite songs to sing to her was, "You Are So Beautiful to Me." Later in life, it was still special to Terry, but also something Christine held as a fond childhood memory of bonding with her mother and the love that her mother had for her. Christine grew up in a loving home, surrounded by her parents and her older brother Derek. He was about 4 years older than Christine. The Johnsons were Episcopalian, and they made church a part of their weekly routine, instilling their faith and morals in their kids. But as devoted as they were to their children, Terry and Kirk realized the two of them were probably not going to stand the test of time as a couple. It was tough. The family would never be the same if they got divorced, but it was the best decision for the Johnsons. This was very hard on Christine. Now she would have to split her time between her mother's and her father's house. Like many other children who have to go through it, it's a very hard adjustment at first, and then it becomes your new normal. Luckily, Christine was very active, so her mind was not always fixated on the turbulence in her household. By 12 years old, she had already landed some small jobs here and there to make some extra spending money. Her father would joke and say that the only issue she had was keeping the jobs. She had an adventurous spirit, and that sometimes meant committing to one thing was a bit difficult. But Christine was still so young. A lot of changes were happening while she was young, like her older brother Derek leaving for the Air Force. It was bittersweet. He was moving on in his life, growing as a person and professionally, but Christine cried and cried having to say goodbye. High school took up most of her time, so of course she had things to look forward to in between the back and forth with her parents, and now her brother being out of the house. Christine was also becoming her own person, and she stood out as she came into her own. As a matter of fact, she was almost impossible to ignore. She stood out even amidst the town's natural beauty with her big blue eyes, blonde hair, and full lips. She was stunning. But it wasn't just her physical attributes that made her shine. It was her infectious laugh. It was loud and wild, and it truly set her apart. When she laughed, so did everyone else, and as they say, it was a contagious laugh. She made you feel good about being in her presence. Christine was undoubtedly beautiful on the outside, but that was far from her most alluring quality. She was warm and open, and she had an innate ability to make people feel good about themselves. She loved nothing more than to share her happiness with others. It's something that made her dad really proud of her. He mentioned how people appreciated her openness and willingness to befriend those she met. In a small town, you have small schools, and Christine's high school was no exception. Her larger-than-life personality filled the hallways, and her iconic laughter echoed through the classrooms and corridors. She left her mark wherever she went. While in high school, Christine got involved in sports, but it wasn't the ones in school that she really loved. It was the ones she did during the summer when she went to visit her grandmother back in Santa Maria, California. One was sailing. She really enjoyed it. But what she loved the most was surfing at Pismo Beach. When she was there, she felt like she was in her element. It felt like home to her. But of course, reality would strike when she had to go back to Michigan. She did her very best to find fun activities to get involved in, and ended up as an active theater club member. It makes sense with her outgoing personality, her laugh, and her smile. She was a natural. Terry said she could tell there was just something special about Christine. It wasn't just that she started turning heads. Terry thought she was so beautiful, but she remembers thinking that Christine just had that something, even back in high school. Well, it's true, Christine would discover that something about herself. But for now, it was more important for her to make it out of high school. When summer painted Saugatuck with its warm hues, the town buzzed with tourists flocking to the picturesque beaches, and these were the times Christine and her friends cherished the most. They loved the vibrancy of their beloved hometown, but as Michigan summer came to a close and the area emptied out, the town's charm gave way to an isolating quiet. The winters were harsh. They were long, sometimes lasting after 3 or 4 months, with temperatures regularly going below zero. This frigid season was so different from the warm and vibrant Christine. It was a constant struggle for her. She did her best to buy her time until the weather warmed up again, like waitressing at a local cafe. The restaurant owner was delighted to have Christine on his staff because she was always cheerful and enthusiastic. Customers who interacted with her were always sure to have an enjoyable experience. And he said that her personality was magnetic. She had such a presence that they wanted her on their staff. She was always bright, happy, and smiling, and when she manned the register, people enjoyed being in the shop because of her. Growing up in a tiny Saugatuck, where even going to a movie theater is a luxury, can ignite a yearning for something bigger. It wasn't long before Christine's growing ambition became apparent to those around her relentless manifesting her dreams of escaping her quiet town. Christine graduated in 1999 from Saugatuck High School, one of only about 60 other seniors in her class. At last, she felt free to start carving out an escape plan. Her high school graduation quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson perfectly encapsulated her enthusiasm for the future. It said, "Reach high for stars lie hidden in your soul. Dream deep, for every dream precedes the goal." Her current goal was to go to college. She chose Western Michigan University out in Kalamazoo, which is about an hour inland from her home on Lake Michigan. It was going to be a change of scenery for one and a change of pace for another. Meeting new people, going on an adventure outside of her small town. Anything can be exciting when it's new. She was also working part-time doing administrative work at a drilling company located in Holland, Michigan, where her dad was living. This change suited her for a while anyway. She made new friends, and she found a new hobby, dancing at raves. There are plenty of parties to attend at college, house parties thrown by their students, sometimes Greek life parties at frat houses or sororities. But then there are warehouse parties, and one step up were the more exclusive ones curated by entertainment companies that went above and beyond, and those were the raves that the cool kids wanted to attend. Raves began with the emergence of house music in the 80s. Lots of young people wanted a place to enjoy dancing, a fun atmosphere, and their favorite music, among other things that I'm sure you know are associated with the culture, like MDMA or ecstasy. There was a pretty well-known company in Detroit, Michigan, called Plur Kids, and they began throwing these massive parties. Everyone wanted in, and their flyers for the parties were pretty famous. There are whole YouTube videos of people who have saved some of these flyers from the 90s. It was a really interesting culture, and I found a Facebook page, of course I did, called Detroit Raves 9601, because I really wanted to get a feel for the way these raves went down and what Christine loved about them. The Facebook group consisted of people just posting memories and pictures of nostalgic places where the raves took place, and there were a ton of responses about how many memories it brought back. Here's a flyer from back in 1999 when Christine was going to Detroit raves, and I found this one to be pretty awesome. You'd feel special getting this flyer. It's like a golden ticket. This one was from November 20th, 1999. It says the 4-hour turntable tag team was 10, Harry Mullen and Charles Feelgood. They were meant to be kind of obscure. There's a guy showcasing one of the flyers from June 3rd. There's a guy showcasing one of the flyers from June 3rd, 2000 on a YouTube channel. And you can tell if the flyers are produced this well, the parties are probably outrageous, crazy, and awesome. I'm saying all of this to say it made quite an impression on young Christine Johnson, but it still was not enough to make her want to stay in Michigan. Any chance she got, she escaped to the sunshine. During spring break, she and her friends went to Florida, and they ended up getting tattoos to memorialize that trip. Christine chose a hibiscus flower across her lower back. The next chance she got, she visited her paternal grandmother in California during the summer of 2000, after just 2 semesters at Western Michigan University. When she came back and experienced another bitter winter in Michigan, she knew this was not where she wanted to be. She would tell her mother that she just wanted to go back to California, where she felt like there were more opportunities and better weather. At 19, Christine was an adult, but of course a young adult. Moving across the country like that would probably not have been possible if it wasn't for the fact her grandmother lived there. So the decision was made. Christine would live with her grandma, Katie Johnson, and attend college in Santa Maria, California. This was an exciting time for her. Now she would get to experience all the things she loved year-round. But Christine was a responsible teenager. She didn't just think she was going to lay around all day soaking up the sun. She got a job right away, this time as a systems administrator for an electrical company. She also enrolled in classes at the local community college with the intention to transfer to California Polytechnic University and study to become an engineer. Maybe she was inspired by working at the electrical supply company, or maybe the drilling business. This I'm not sure. But wow, the house she was living in was gorgeous. Just the weather, the bright blue sky, even just on Google Maps, you can tell how different it is from the dreary weather in Michigan. A few months after taking classes at the community college, Christine went to tour the Cal Poly campus, which is in San Luis Obispo, about 40 minutes away from her grandmother's house. It's to the north, further from Los Angeles, and closer to where her mother, Terry, had just moved. Her mom decided to move out to Northern California not too long after Christine made the move to Santa Maria. Even though they were still going to be about 3.5 hours apart, they were still much closer than they would have been if Terry was back in Michigan. It made her feel good about Christine making such a big move. They talked on the phone every day, usually more than once, and they were very close. Christine shared everything with her mom, especially her experience while visiting this new school campus. She knew she was going to enroll, and she began looking for jobs in the area. Now, I'm not sure where she was looking, but back then I remember those days. We used Craigslist. It was really popular, so I wouldn't be surprised if that's where students were going to look for work. Eventually, Christine found a part-time job listing for a position on the set of an upcoming movie. Considering she has a background in theater, and of course anything to do with movies would sound really exciting, Christine applied. She didn't think she was going to get it, but to her surprise and delight, she got hired to work as an assistant on the set of a thriller called Murder by Numbers. If you don't remember or know about this movie, it premiered on April 19th, 2002. It's inspired by the true crime story of Leopold and Loeb. Two very gifted high school students try to execute the perfect murder. In the movie, they're two rich kids growing up in California who get together to try to mastermind this murder and pin it on other people. So while this was in production, the casting crew were filming all over San Luis Obispo, and Christine was joining them. For someone like her from a very small town, this was huge. These were superstars, and this experience sparked something inside of Christine. She was now making friends and getting to know people who lived and breathed everything Hollywood-related. She realized this could be a new direction for her professionally. She really liked being on set, and actually she wanted to be part of what went on behind the scenes. So she decided to enroll in makeup classes at the Makeup Designery School in Burbank. She would be learning professional makeup artistry from licensed instructors with expertise in film, television, and fashion. Christine also realized, in order to pursue this new goal, she would probably need to move closer to where everything was going on, but she faced that daunting journey ahead. Los Angeles seemed like a world away, even from Santa Maria. That was just a taste of California, but the call of her dreams was stronger than the fear of the unknown, and she was ready to step into this exciting new chapter of her life. Christine decided to move to West Hollywood on Palm Avenue, where she would be closer to jobs in movie production. A lot of studios are in Hollywood, and in Burbank, that's where Disney, DreamWorks, and Warner Brothers studios are, just to name a few. She figured being close by would open up many doors for her. She knew it was a gamble, but with a dash of luck, she believed that she could make it. Little did she know how swiftly and dramatically fortunes can change. So just like that, Christine left the comfort and security of her grandmother's in Santa Maria and moved to Los Angeles, a sprawling city teeming with 3.7 million residents. LA, the city of angels, where stars are born and dreams become reality. It was a stark contrast to the life Christine was used to. Now, during my research, I read a lot of blog posts, articles, and even watched some shows about this case, and most of them made it seem like Christine came out to LA with the intention to go straight into Hollywood and become this big star. That was why she made the move in the first place. But that's not accurate. Christine had family in California. She was born there. Her mother, Terry, moved back to Northern California to be close to her. It's where she felt at home. It wasn't Christine's plan. Santa Maria was not close to Hollywood or LA. But once she started taking those makeup classes in Burbank and working on the sets of various productions in high fashion shoots, her passion grew. But this is hard work. It's hours of standing on your feet, driving all around Los Angeles in some of the most congested areas and finding parking, not getting benefits like medical insurance. And as fun as it was to begin with, it started to wear on Christine. Right now in Hollywood, writers and actors are stopping production to protest their contracts because they're not being paid their worth. So just imagine someone like Christine in an even lower position. They don't call them starving artists for nothing. In her new city, Christine began the search for more job opportunities, but she quickly realized that LA wasn't as welcoming as her hometown. She may have been a standout in Saugatuck, but in Hollywood, young dreamers like her were everywhere. It was tough for her to find work. It was very competitive, and Christine was just waiting for that big break. But everyone knows that they don't come easily in the film industry. At least she felt like she found her footing professionally and just needed to keep pushing. Christine's next goal was to have a social life, taking one more step toward making LA her new home. The flashy skill club scene of LA initially was very overwhelming for Christine, but it wasn't long before she found friends that made the new environment less intimidating. Among them was Aaron Garcia. The first time he met her, he remembered her walking in, lighting up the room, and he immediately knew she was not from LA. Together they explored something familiar to Christine, the rave scene. But the LA scene was new to her, and she was swept up in the excitement. Her city-wise friends found Christine's small-town charm a refreshing change because, despite her strikingly good looks, usually associated with vanity or being superficial, people were pleasantly surprised by her big heart. However, Christine was a bit naive, and sometimes it made her vulnerable. The rave scene can be filled with drugs and dubious individuals. It wasn't without its challenges for the trusting young woman from a small Michigan town. Because she was so beautiful, she was constantly being hit on by men, so she had to learn to navigate this new world with all its potential danger. As adventurous as she was, she also liked to stick to what she knew, and she knew a guy that she was already interested in. His name was Todd. They had met a couple of years before and began dating up until he moved away, but they kept in touch, and it wasn't long before they decided to move in together in West LA, splitting the rent because it was much better than paying for it in full. Although financial stability for now was still a struggle for 20-year-old Christine, she wasn't giving up. In July of 2002, she wrote her dad very excited, addressing him saying, "Hey Daddy-o," before telling him how excited she was that she was working on an upcoming music video. She said, "I was so nervous when I got down here, but I knew this is what I wanted, so I stuck with it, and now I'm on my way." She really felt like she was making it, slow but steady. However, she still found herself grappling with professional uncertainty. Her career seemed stuck in neutral after her initial foray into the movie industry as a production assistant. Finding the next step in her Hollywood journey proved to be challenging. But still clinging to her dreams, Christine began looking for a day job to make ends meet. That wasn't the only challenge she was facing. As many young couples come to find out, there's a honeymoon phase to relationships, and it had passed for her and Todd. Their relationship was unraveling. Finances were tight, loyalty was being tested, and their arguments were escalating, leading to some terrifying moments for Christine. She confided in her mother about what was happening. She felt trapped because she couldn't afford to be out there on her own. But she also recognized the danger of staying in a toxic relationship that had started to become physical. Terry wanted to help. She started to look for places where Christine could move, somewhere that she could share with other women, roommates. While her mom was on the search for an apartment, Christine was looking for a job. This was all the wake-up call for her. Even though it was exciting, Christine started to think that maybe it was a good idea to go back to school and get a degree. That way, she would have something to fall back on in case this Hollywood thing didn't work out. Just a few months after that message to her dad, where she seemed to have it all figured out, she was now in the process of trying to find her footing again. Her dad would graciously wire her money anytime she was in a bind, so fortunately, Christine wasn't completely on her own. Her parents, despite their reservations, provided financial support. Her mom helped her by gifting her a car, a white convertible 1996 Mazda Miata, paying her cell phone bill and supplementing her rent. This would help ease her transition into this new phase of her life. Like many people in the arts, she found herself working outside of her field of interest. By November 2002, Christine finally landed a job doing data entry at a cellular company called CNCG in Marina del Rey, which is a little out of the way from West Hollywood. Like, it would be a drive. So she and her mom started looking for apartments in that area, but they had no luck. Finally, Terry was able to find her something in her price range. She would be splitting the rent with 2 other women. It wasn't in Marina del Rey, but close enough in Santa Monica, which is a beach town in LA. It was a 3-bedroom apartment with a gated parking garage that Christine would be sharing. This is 29th Street, a very residential area. It isn't walking distance to the beach, but close enough to get down there and experience beach life, which we know that Christine loved. It's also a central location. It's close enough to LAX for traveling, and also if you want to go out to Hollywood for production-related jobs. But at this point, Christine had decided to enroll at Santa Monica College. She worked weekdays all day from 9 to 6, and then she took classes at night, hoping to transfer to UCLA. After about a year, her move-in day to this apartment was December 19th, 2002. Just a couple of months later, in February 2003, 21-year-old Christine's 2 years in LA had not unfolded as she had hoped. Her day job was unfulfilling, her career was stalled, her relationship had ended badly, and her dreams were far from being realized. But despite these setbacks, Christine remained determined. Her dad even tried to convince her to return to Michigan, but she was hesitant to abandon her Hollywood dreams. She clung to the belief that her big break was coming. Christine knew exactly what she wanted to do. She just had to figure out how to make it happen. Her birthday was coming up that month on the 22nd, and Valentine's Day had just passed. Now, there was a long weekend for President's Day, and that meant fun. The streets of LA are crowded with more people whenever there's a holiday, and they don't have to go to work on Monday. Although Christine was scheduled to work Monday the 17th, President's Day, since her workplace was still open, she wanted to enjoy her weekend at least. So she planned on going to a rave on Saturday night, February 15th. In that case, she needed to buy a few things from the mall. Her mother called her that morning, as usual, and as they spoke, she told Christine that she would give her some early spending money for her birthday, so just buy whatever she wanted at the mall, and Terry would deposit money into her account to cover it later. By that afternoon, Christine was on her way. The closest mall to where she was the famous Century City Mall in Santa Monica. I was just there last month, and it's gorgeous. It's very upscale, and the history is interesting. It was actually built on the back lot of Fox Studios in 1964. The studio sold the land to offset their budget on the Cleopatra movie. About a block away, you're walking on the Avenue of the Stars, one of the first streets in the town of Century City that was formed on this backlot of Fox. I don't like going to this part of town at all because I don't like driving there. It's way too much for me, but for a 21-year-old, this would be ideal for some LA shopping. Christine headed out, and as usual, she talked to her mom about all of her plans for that holiday weekend. But there wouldn't be anything usual about this weekend at all. As the phone conversation ended, Terry and Christine said, "I love you" to one another before hanging up, as they did with every phone call. Later, Terry wanted to know how the shopping trip went, so she tried calling her daughter, but she never answered. Terry knew how busy Christine was going to be hanging out with friends and having a good time, so she figured she would catch up with her the next day. But that's the thing. The next day, on Sunday, when Terry would usually get a call from her daughter, she never received one. So she tried calling Christine and again received no answer. Terry paid for Christine's phone so that she would always be able to contact her. So this was a bit worrisome, especially since the phone was going straight to voicemail. Isn't that always the sign? Terry knew that she paid the bill, so she thought, okay, maybe after a long night of partying, Christine's phone died and she just hadn't charged it before going to bed. We come up with the most logical reasons first, but by Sunday evening, Terry was getting more concerned. She still hadn't heard from her daughter, but again figured Christine was just busy. If need be, she would reach out Monday morning because she knew Christine would be at work, and that's exactly what she did. Again, Monday morning, Christine's cell was still going to voicemail. Maybe she lost it. Maybe it broke. Only a few minutes past 9 a.m., Terry decided to call Christine's workplace. She typically picked up the phone at her desk, but this time it rang and rang until Terry got Christine's recorded message. Frustrated, Terry decided to call the main phone number, and she reached Christine's manager. She asked if Christine was there and if there was a reason why she wouldn't be answering her phone. This was the moment when things got even more concerning. The manager told Terry that Christine had not shown up that morning. Terry asked if they knew where she would be, and the manager said, "No, we don't. She's always been so reliable over the last 3 months of employment. She never missed one shift, and if she was running even a little behind, which only happened maybe once or twice, she would let them know." They said the last time they saw her was in the office on February 14th, Friday. The manager explained that her co-workers were surprised when Christine didn't show up. One of them was a good friend of hers. He knew she had plans to attend a rave on Saturday night. She had told him about it on Friday, but she never mentioned where it was going to be. Terry didn't know what to do. She quickly got in touch with her ex-husband, Christine's father, Kirk, in Holland, Michigan, and told him what was going on. They agreed if Christine didn't turn up that day, they would have to go to the police. Meanwhile, Terry had an idea. She logged online to Christine's cell phone account as well as her bank account, which they shared, but neither one of them had any information that would help her locate her daughter. She also called her older son, Derek, and informed him about what was going on. No one in her family had heard from her since Saturday. She'd had enough. She called the Santa Monica Police Department to report her 21-year-old daughter missing. First, they wanted to check to see if anyone by the name Christine Johnson, or someone matching her description, had been in any reported vehicle accident since Saturday, and there were no matching reports. The officer proceeded to advise Terry to try contacting hospitals in the surrounding area, just to be sure that Christine hadn't had a medical emergency and had been admitted. Terry tried every hospital with no luck, so she called back Officer Mark Holland from Santa Monica PD and told him she wanted to make an official report that Christine Johnson was not accounted for and therefore missing. Think about saying those words. It's terrifying. Of course, they were still trying to get in touch with her roommates and anyone else who may know where Christine is, but they needed help. Terry was over 3 hours away, and Kirk was back in Michigan, but he promised to fly straight to California if Christine didn't show up by Tuesday. Terry gave Officer Holland all of Christine's info, that she was 5 feet 9 inches, around 140 pounds, had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a slender build, and that she had a geometric hibiscus flower tattoo across her lower back. She drove a 1996 white Mazda Miata with a black convertible top and a California license plate. She also let him know that she recently had a tumultuous relationship with a guy named Todd Calabas, and that they both lived in a West Hollywood apartment together before she moved in with her 2 roommates. Terry also explained that she and Christine shared a bank account, and that she paid for Christine's phone, so she had access to all of the records. That was pertinent information. Officer Holland got to work pretty quickly. He wanted to rule out the possibility that perhaps Christine and her roommates had gone somewhere for the weekend, or that they may know where she is. So he was able to get into contact with one of the girls that she lived with, Carrie Barish. For the record, I don't know if this is her real name. A lot of people's names are protected for privacy reasons. But obviously we need to call her Carrie, so it's not confused. Using this information, Officer Holland asked her when the last time she had seen Christine was, and whether she knew where she was now. Carrie was surprised that a cop was calling her, but she told him that Christine was just going about her normal routine. She had only known her about 3 months, so she didn't have intimate details about Christine's personal life, but she was just auditioning, shopping, partying, hanging out, and working. The usual, nothing out of the ordinary. She said she saw her on Saturday afternoon. Christine had just returned from the mall and was rushing around getting ready for an audition, and then had to hurry to a party that she had paid for and RSVP'd to. So of course, Officer Holland is like, "Can we talk in specifics here? Do you know where these things were? Like, where's the audition? Where's the party?" But Carrie said she had no idea in regards to the locations. This was not much information to go on, and Holland had to gather as much as he could because he was going to provide it to detectives when they took over the case for an investigation. But by 2 p.m. on February 17th, he was armed with all the information that we know right now. He handed off the case to veteran detective Virginia O. Pinchane. She had been working at the Santa Monica Police Department for almost 2 decades. She'd seen it all, especially working in LA. As soon as Detective O. Pinchane was briefed on Christine's case, she got a really sick feeling. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She got chills. That's because certain aspects of this case reminded her a lot of another case from LA that happened back in 1996. It involved a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, aspiring actress and model who was a Los Angeles Raiders cheerleader, 27-year-old Linda Sobeck. She had also talked to her mother the last day she was seen, and she was going to a last-minute photo shoot before an audition that she landed for the TV show Married with Children. It was on November 16th, 1996, but when her mom reached out later to find out how everything went, she wasn't able to get in touch with Linda. Linda's father, Bob, her mother, Elaine, and her brother, Steve, hadn't heard from her in a couple of days. Does this sound familiar? So they made a police report, and eventually the police linked a photographer named Charles Rathbun. He admitted that he met Linda to discuss a portfolio, but that he didn't know where she was. Well, it turns out this man, Southern Man the Stranger, found photos of a woman out in the middle of the Angeles National Forest, and that was odd, so he handed them over to police because he saw the news about Linda being missing, and he thought the woman in the photos looked like her. Sure enough, that was Linda. So investigators went out to this forest area and found a day planner and a car rental agreement in the trash. On the agreement was that name, Charles Rathbun. He broke down and admitted that he was shooting Linda for a car magazine. He rented a Lexus SUV to get some really cool shots of her driving in the desert, but he had no idea where she was. Well, there was blood found on that car, so they knew he was lying. So he finally told them that he was driving the car and he lost control and ran her over by accident. Then he was scared and buried her in the Angeles National Forest. This man later showed investigators the shallow grave where Linda's body was, but her injuries were not consistent with the car crash, and the car didn't have any damage. So, things were not adding up. The autopsy showed that she had been engaged in a sexual act, which they suspected was forced, and she had most likely been asphyxiated. Charles tried changing his story many times, saying that it was consensual, part of a deal, and that many photographers know how these things work. Ultimately, it was found that he had lied to Linda from the beginning. He lured her out into the desert to force her into relations with him, and then he killed her. This case was making national headlines back then, and it's one that so many people in Hollywood remember. Many women were afraid to work with photographers after hearing about it because they thought they might be next. Detective O. Pinchane didn't want to jump to conclusions because, statistically speaking, the city is saturated with beautiful young women and men aspiring to be models and actors. One of them is bound to end up missing, maybe of their own volition, because perhaps the Hollywood dream just didn't work out, and they decided to go back home. So she needed to create a timeline and gather more information. The biggest piece of evidence they had at the time was the information about her car. They put out a bolo, instructing officers to be on the lookout for a white convertible Mazda Miata. Next, O. Pinchane interviewed Terry. She asked her to try to recall anyone her daughter had mentioned recently. Terry said, "Well, there's this guy Lucas, who Christine told me was very attractive. He was living in her apartment building but moving out soon. He asked her to go on a trip to Hawaii with him." There was also her recent ex, Todd. That's when Terry admitted that there had been times when Christine and Todd had physical altercations. Todd was possessive over her, had locked her out of her apartment and even out of her own car once. That didn't sound good. The detective knew Todd would be one of the next people she wanted to interview, but she had some good news for Terry. There were no reports of any bodies at the coroner's office that matched Christine's description. Any others had already been identified. I guess that would be relieving, but it also meant that the detective was already thinking Christine could be dead. How heartbreaking for a parent to hear that. But they couldn't rule anything out. Their goal, of course, was to find Christine before anything bad happened. The weekend had already passed. It had been 48 hours, and we know those are the most crucial hours in a missing persons investigation. On day 2 of the investigation, Detective O'Pinchain began looking into the limited cell phone data that she could pull up at the time. It wasn't like it is today, but what she could ascertain was that the last outgoing call from Christine's phone was at 5:34 p.m., and it was to 411. Back then, you called 411 when you needed an operator to assist you with something, usually related to a phone number or an address. That call was 3 minutes in length. This seemed important to O'Pinchain. Had Christine gotten lost somewhere? Maybe she was stranded, and then her phone died? They were able to tell that her phone pinged off a tower on Ventura Boulevard, but they couldn't give an exact location, and that radius is pretty large. The next step was contacting the media. As much as these days it seems like a double-edged sword, there are so many cases solved by media attention, but you also get fake leads and people wanting to inject themselves into the case for their 5 minutes of fame, especially here in LA. Detective O'Pinchain knew the value of making the public aware of what was going on. There could be a kidnapper out there, or worse. She started compiling photos of Christine to make posters and give them to local news stations. Of course, once the local media got hold of the information, you can probably guess what the headline said. Beautiful blonde, aspiring model and actress missing, may have been headed to meet a photographer. Even though those weren't the exact facts given, with so many people in the entertainment industry, this was going to bring a lot more attention to the case. It would make people feel unsafe, scared, and it would affect them more because they could relate. The media knew that. Plus, with the Linda Sobek case still so fresh in everyone's minds, it was like they were having flashbacks to those same headlines from 1996. Most, if not all, the articles I read from February 20th said, 21-year-old Santa Monica woman who may have been on her way to Beverly Hills to meet a photographer has not been seen for 5 days. They also gave a description of her car, mentioned her family and friends' concerns, and urged anyone with information to call the Santa Monica Police Department. O'Pinchain obtained a search warrant for Christine's apartment, and investigators scoured every room, looking for anything that could lead them to her whereabouts. They also collected items that might contain DNA in case they needed it later, things like a toothbrush, hairbrush, discarded food, and so on. While conducting the search, investigators found something that seemed relevant, a receipt from a lingerie store. The date was February 15th, the day Christine went missing. This was collected, and now investigators were reaching out to Bank of America to get a detailed report of all the retail locations Christine bought items from that day. Now, this lingerie store is famous in LA. It's a bright pink building, and it's actually a private store. You need to purchase a $2 membership to shop there. This rule was put in place to deter people from going in for the wrong reasons. Their website says, if you're in the Los Angeles area and want to shop where the stars like Jennifer Lawrence, Jennifer Aniston, Gwyneth Paltrow, Emma Stone, and Mila Kunis buy their intimates, you need a membership to Trashy Lingerie. Though it's called a lingerie store, they also sell costumes, shoes, hats, wigs, swimwear, and more. With so many themed parties and Playboy Mansion events in LA, people shop there for much more than lingerie. Detectives know Christine was planning to go to a rave, so she most likely bought something for her outfit. It's another clue to investigate, along with others like examining Christine's work computer. By this point, posters were being handed out, especially around the Century City Mall, where they knew Christine had been that day. By the end of the first week, detectives had collected a lot of useful tips, many from friends and family. They now had more leads to follow. One tip provided more information about her ex, Todd. Her roommate, Carrie, mentioned that Christine had visited Todd on the weekend of February 7th, just before she went missing. Todd had moved to Santa Maria, where Christine's grandmother lived. Christine visited there often, so she had stopped by to see him and hang out with her ex. The last time Carrie saw Christine, she was wearing an outfit she had purchased on that trip, a pair of baby blue corduroy low-rise pants with slits near the ankles and fringe. She also wore a sleeveless white top with tiny light blue stripes that matched the pants. Now they knew what Christine was probably wearing when she left her apartment, which was vital for asking the public if they had seen her. Analysts have been checking her computer, and they got into her email account. That's when they found their next big lead, an email Christine sent to an event coordinator on Thursday morning, February 13th. It was in relation to the rave on Saturday night. Apparently, Christine found out about the party online. It was happening in downtown LA in a 2-story industrial warehouse. She sent an email to the coordinator, talking about how she hadn't gone out in a while and was really looking forward to this event because of the lineup. It reminded her of back in the day when she used to go to Plur Kids shows in Detroit. However, she was informed that afternoon in a response email that the tickets were already sold out. The coordinator said he would put Christine's name on a special list, but it didn't mean she had a ticket, nor was this a formal admission of any kind. It all depended on how many people showed up. Upon further investigation, detectives determined that this was just a marketing tactic. They try to hype up these events to make them sound exclusive, only to give you a link later to buy tickets or VIP passes, effectively upselling you. It wasn't clear if Christine knew this at the time, but she had plans to attend the event since she had told people, like her coworker, that she was going on Saturday. By now, investigators had a couple more names to check out. Lucas from the apartment building was one. They connected with him, and it turns out he admitted to running into Christine as she was walking up from the parking garage that Saturday afternoon. He said she was her usual excited, happy self and mentioned she was in a rush to get to an audition before heading out to a party, consistent with what they had already heard. He also provided an alibi, which checked out. Carrie had also mentioned that there was a random guy visiting Christine on the night of February 14th, Valentine's Day, but it wasn't her ex. They made the link when a tip came in from a guy who admitted being over there. He claimed they were just friends, watched a movie together, and that he left sometime after midnight. They had met through the rave scene about a year earlier. Now that they knew he had information about raves, they figured, okay, the rave scene is known for drugs and interesting characters. Could something have happened? Could she have disappeared from the rave? They started asking him about Christine's behavior at these parties. Was she a big drinker? Did she do drugs? He said, I don't know her to be the type of person to do drugs. She just liked to dance to the music. He never saw her heavily intoxicated or doing drugs. Okay, so they didn't get too much further here, but finally they tracked down Christine's ex, Todd. Her circle of friends told them he didn't take the breakup very well at all. The police were beginning to have their suspicions about him, so he was brought in for questioning. Todd was determined to clear his name and prove his innocence. He was willing to do whatever it took. He told the detectives that he loved Christine very much and would never hurt her. He willingly took the 100-mile drive from Santa Maria to Santa Monica for an interview. They first asked him how he and Christine met. He said it was back in 2000. They were at an event in San Bernardino while Christine was visiting her grandma. They connected and were just friends until Halloween of 2000 when they became an item. They dated for about a year until Todd moved away to Texas, but they kept in touch here and there. About a year ago, in February 2002, Christine flew out to Texas to visit him. They had a really good time and wanted to continue seeing each other, even though it was long distance. In April, during another trip to Texas, they discussed moving in together. They talked about everything, including Christine's living situation, being by herself in Hollywood and struggling. Todd agreed to move out and in with her in California. They tried making it work, but he said that the issues were about Christine not having a steady job and them disagreeing on boundaries with the opposite sex, with her going to auditions and all of that. It just wasn't working out, and it did become physical, as rumored. Todd insisted it was actually Christine who started to hit him. It was before Thanksgiving, in November 2002. He only hit back in response. He said he slapped her a couple of times and did lock her out of her car, but that was because he didn't want her to drive away in anger and get hurt. They didn't know what to believe, but Todd did tell them that soon after that, he moved out. Now, to the more important question, did he know where Christine was? He said no. They asked him where he was on February 15th, and he said he was all the way out in Santa Maria that day. To prove his alibi, Todd provided the police with evidence that he had been dirt biking and gave them several friends to check with. It turned out his alibi was corroborated by his friends. So there you have it. Todd was ruled out as a person of interest, at least for the time being. They were trying hard to pin down a timeline of the last time Christine was seen, so they got in touch with the rave coordinator and requested a copy of the guest list. They were actually shocked when they saw it. Christine's name was not crossed off. This meant she never made it to the party. But of course, they needed to press even further. They asked the coordinator if she was sure that Christine hadn't shown up. She said yes. Her mom, her brother, and 4 of her friends were responsible for checking each person's identification. There were 135 people that entered, and when they did, each one of them was marked off the list to make sure they were accounted for, mostly so they wouldn't ask for refunds. So what happened to Christine? Well, Christine's bank records were finally faxed over, and this helped a lot with the timeline. According to her debit card transactions, Christine made a purchase at 11:45 a.m. on February 15th at a Starbucks on Santa Monica Boulevard. Then, at 11:58 a.m., a transaction was made at a 76 gas station, also on Santa Monica Boulevard. So now they know she probably filled up her tank for her plans later. Could they rule out that she ran out of gas somewhere and was in trouble because of that? They don't know, but it seems more likely that wasn't the case. By 1:33 p.m., a transaction was made at Bloomingdale's department store in Century City Mall. Now they know that she was there, or at least her debit card was. Then, just 3 minutes later, another transaction was made from a store across from Bloomingdale's at Guess. The final debit card record on her account shows that at 2:15 p.m., Christine's card was used at Trashy Lingerie Store on La Cienega Boulevard. I made a little map to show you all of these locations. I'm showing you where her apartment is on 29th Street, the Starbucks, which was only a few minutes away from her apartment, the gas station on her way to Century City Mall, and then her destination where she used her card at Trashy Lingerie. Then she went back home. The last call she made was at 5:34 p.m., somewhere within a 3-mile radius on Ventura Boulevard, which could put her anywhere. Investigators are now going to request the security footage from Century City Mall, specifically any footage that might show Christine in the stores that they found on her bank statement. They want to see if there was something unusual going on. Was she acting differently? Was someone forcing her to do anything against her will? Or if anything was just out of the ordinary? Maybe she had a weird interaction with an employee in the mall or a stranger. It's Friday, February 20th. It's a little past noon, and as they're waiting for all this evidence to come in, they're combing through hundreds of tips. One grabs their attention. A 24-year-old woman named Susan Murphy gives them a call. Susan says that she just saw an article in the LA Times about Christine's disappearance, and as soon as she read it, her heart sank. She had this overwhelming gut feeling that she might have some information about what happened. They're listening, and she goes on to explain she works as an accountant in Santa Monica. Here's where she makes the connection. On January 24th, about a month ago, after work around 5:30 p.m., she changed out of her work clothes and into something a little more fun for a dinner that she was going to at 7 p.m. The restaurant was at that same mall, Century City. She remembers what she was wearing because of what happened next. She had on a gray mini skirt, a tight black crewneck sweater, dark pantyhose, and black knee-high boots. She walked to the mall from her workplace. It was only about a 10-minute walk. She went through Macy's and decided to look around at some clothing and accessories for a little bit. Then she took the elevator to the second floor, just browsing. All of a sudden, she felt the presence of someone next to her. There was a guy standing right beside her. He just came out of nowhere. She described him as being about 6 feet tall, with blue eyes, smooth skin, well put together, clean-shaven, with kind of curly or wavy hair. He was attractive, in his 30s, wearing khaki pants, a beige-colored coat, and a baseball cap. Casual but put together. Then he spoke and just said, "I think you're very attractive." She was trying to respond to the comment to be polite, so she told him that was very nice of him. That seemed to end their interaction. He turned around and started walking away, minding his own business. But then, it's like he had a second thought. He turned back around and walked right back to her, standing next to her again. He introduced himself as Victor Thomas, saying he was the director of photography for a company called Silver Screen Partners, which was connected with the Disney company. He proceeded to explain that they were working on casting for a new James Bond movie. He also made sure to let her know that this had to stay between them, as the production had a strict expectation of confidentiality. However, he was letting her know all this because, even though it's not his job to look for talent, they had been casting for weeks. He said he had sat through so many auditions just to bump into Susan and think to himself, she would be perfect if she's interested. He went on to say that he preferred an actress with a smaller chest and thicker thighs, more toned and athletic but slim, and she had it, she had the look. Well, she had heard this before, being in LA, but at the same time, you never know, and it piqued her interest. She had time to kill, so they walked together and just started chatting about it. They went to the food court, and this guy offered to buy Susan a coffee. She declined because she didn't drink coffee, so instead, he just bought her a Snapple. They sat and chatted. He seemed nice, ordinary, respectful, and knowledgeable about the film industry. There are stories of women who are noticed at malls and become famous, so even though Susan was kind of skeptical at first, she entertained Victor's conversation and flattery. He explained that for this movie, Sean Connery and Pierce Brosnan would be coming together in the film. The main position they were casting for would be a billboard, and the amount, it would pay $100,000. That sounded too good to be true, but then again, it also sounded different from the run-of-the-mill offers and acting jobs in LA. They're usually paying nothing, and most people don't take them seriously anyway, but this sounded promising if it panned out. So Susan told the detective she really hoped this would be true, because being a Bond girl would be amazing, it's legendary. She asked Victor what the process would be. He said, well, Sean and Pierce, they would be at the local studio the very next day, so maybe you could convince them to see you for an impromptu audition upon his recommendation, of course. Here's where things get interesting though, if they're not already. He asked her if she'd be interested, and Susan said sure. He went on to tell her that what she needed to wear had to be very specific for this casting. She had to make the best impression. It needed to be something that would exude the qualities of a Bond girl. He was very specific, so she took note. Are you ready for this? He told her to wear a black mini skirt, the shorter and tighter, the better. A white men's-style button-up collared long-sleeve shirt, sheer black pantyhose in 1940s style, and black stiletto heels. Her hair, which was dark brown, needed to be tightly secured back into a ponytail. He told her that he was going to provide a necktie to complete the outfit. When she got to the studio, she was to meet him the next day, on Saturday at 5:30 p.m., at an address he scribbled on a piece of paper. It was off La Cienega Boulevard, close to Santa Monica Boulevard, and that was it. She agreed to meet him and left for dinner with friends. He followed behind her for a little while and then said goodbye, expressing how excited he was about the next day. Susan was too, but she was also apprehensive. When she got home that night, she told her fiancé, Mark Wilson, about the whole story. He just happened to be a former police officer from London, England, and he was more than skeptical of jokers like this who just walk up to women and start spitting this kind of BS. He knew how attractive Susan was and how men think. It sounded like this man just wanted to get closer to his woman, and he wasn't a fan of the entire thing. It sounded very scammy to him, but then again, they thought, well, what if it's true? It could be life-changing for them, so they decided to go together. Mark would drive Susan to meet with this guy, but he would park at a distance so that it wouldn't be too suspicious. Then she would walk up, wait by herself, and he would keep an eye on everything that was going on. If anything weird happened, he would run over there to save the day. But at least this would give Susan a chance to find out if this was a real opportunity. However, Susan did not feel comfortable wearing that skimpy outfit that Victor had instructed her to put on. It was too much, the heels and everything. Walking down the street in it just wasn't going to happen. So she just put on the shirt, since that was appropriate, and she just came in pants and sneakers, putting the heels and the other items into a bag and bringing them along. She walked to the location and waited. About 10 minutes later, Victor showed up as promised. She also told Mark she wouldn't go anywhere with this guy. Victor was in a business suit, carrying some papers and a pen in his hand. However, the look on his face gave Susan a bad vibe before he even said a word. He looked angry and upset and said, "That's not what I told you to wear. I'm taking you somewhere to change." He saw Susan's reaction and kind of toned down his attitude. He said, "Oh, let's just go get a drink somewhere, talk about the roles. You'll get more comfortable and prepared." As he said this, he actually touched Susan, nudging her forward with his hand on her shoulder. She was scared and uneasy and turned around saying, "I'm not going anywhere with you. It's a natch. You need to provide me with some ID and proof that you work for this company." Victor acted insulted, saying, "How dare you?" He was like, "I left my wallet on set," but Susan wouldn't back down. She said, "Oh well," to which he shouted, "You know what? You're giving up on an opportunity of a lifetime." He was really upset at this point. Susan told him off, saying, "No, actually my safety is the most important thing." Victor didn't seem to want to give up on Susan. He actually wanted her to go with him and tried telling her, "Come on, let's just go meet my friend Natasha. We can discuss everything." Susan didn't know who Natasha was and knew this was probably a big scam. She didn't follow him and said she backed away. At that point, Victor had to get in the last word, saying, "You know what? Forget about it. You're not right for the part anyway." As this was all going down, Mark was driving up. He jumped out of his car and ran after Victor. His cop instinct just kicked in. He could tell this guy was up to no good. Victor ran, and Mark and Susan jumped in their car and raced after him. This man was trying to get through security gates at buildings but couldn't, so he ran down an alley. Mark took a back way and tried to cut him off at the end of the alley. When they drove down there, they saw this man crouched under a bush, and when they got closer, he ran again. Finally, they were able to corner him. Mark jumped out, caught up to him, grabbed him, and patted him down to make sure he wasn't armed. It was true, he didn't have a wallet on him. So maybe this was just a misunderstanding, but Mark couldn't help himself. He started yelling, telling him they were going to kill him or bring him to the police, and probing him about his intentions and the name of the company he worked for. At this point, Victor was kind of crying, insisting he worked for Disney. But before letting him go, he tells Victor, "I need to get a number from you. I'm going to call it, and I'm going to verify that you're who you say you are." So they went over to the car to get a cell phone. But as soon as he starts dialing in this number, Victor runs. It turns out it was a fake number. The next day, Susan called the police, but as she was waiting on hold, she thought, "You know what? I better not, because there's no actual crime to report. It was all speculation. There's no proof." But she was a part of SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, so she called them and asked, "Is there a James Bond movie currently casting?" They said no, there's nothing in production, there's nothing casting. Now she had confirmation that this guy, Victor, truly was up to no good. But what were his intentions? Was he going to harm her, force himself on her, or kill her? Or was he just using his pull as a supposed businessman in Hollywood as a pickup line, with no cruel intentions except maybe to get to know her better? She didn't know, but she just knew it didn't feel right. This was all very interesting. It was a really scary scenario. Opinchain is glad that nothing happened to Susan, but she doesn't really know how this relates to Christine. The only connection was the location at Century City Mall. With as many people who frequent a location, it could be a coincidence and not a connection. However, because of how detailed Susan was about what she was instructed to wear, coupled with the reaction that Victor gave her when she didn't show up in it, they decided to see whether Christine had purchased items that matched that description. So the detectives decided to call and get itemized receipts from every store that Christine used her debit card at that day, as well as footage from January 24th. Maybe the cameras at the mall captured Susan talking to this man. Meanwhile, they ran the name Victor Thomas and nothing came up. But there was something they could do. Susan and Mark got a good look at this guy. By the next day, they asked a sketch artist to come and meet them to create a composite of this man. I always wondered how this process is carried out, so I looked it up. There are all kinds of different methods, usually using a computer with a face, and the artist will keep changing the features until it matches as closely as possible to what the witness saw. But back then, they did it with pictures of different people's faces with different features, and then the witness would pick ones to be drawn on the composite until it was completed. This took several hours. Afterwards, Susan went to the mall with the detectives and showed them all the places that she remembered going to that day. Afterward, they went to the security office, pulled up the footage, went through it, and they finally caught a glimpse of Susan. She said, "That's me." She came through an entrance and then a man was following closely behind her. They were able to freeze a frame that showed as much detail as possible, for as grainy as these videos always are. Susan was like, "Oh my God, that's him? He's wearing a baseball cap," as she described. So they ended that day with a lot of information. There was still a lot of footage to go through to locate Christine on the mall cameras. But the next day, her dad, Kirk Johnson, was sitting down with investigators, hardly able to hold it together. He felt helpless. He knew his daughter was nice and naive. She saw the best in people, and she had been taken advantage of in the past. The search was intensifying. There were dogs sent out to track Christine, volunteers searching canyons, and officers patrolling different locations from Santa Monica to Beverly Hills, hoping to locate Christine's car. Several calls did come in from people who said they saw a Mazda Miata, but none of those tips panned out. It wasn't until Monday, February 24th, that they got something reliable to check into. After the bolo was sent out, the case got wider media attention all around the city. Parking garages were checking diligently to make sure Christine's car wasn't inside. They do this on a routine check every day, but now the checks were being conducted with a specific car in mind, and not just like a random abandoned car. So there's a hotel parking garage that provided parking for two hotels, Century Plaza and the St. Regis, both in Century City, where the mall is located. As a matter of fact, it's right near the mall. It's right here. This is the distance. Now, of course, things have changed since 2003. This is not exactly what the hotels look like today, because they've undergone renovations, and there are new hotels and they've changed their names. But this is the vicinity of where the hotels were, and this is what the area looks like now. It could be a new one, but regardless, just imagine it was somewhere right in this area because this is the vicinity where the hotels were located. As a matter of fact, it's so close to the mall, it's walking distance. People could possibly park their cars in this garage if they wanted to. It's a 2-minute drive to the mall where Christine had been the day she disappeared. Well, we know that she also made it home that day because her roommate saw her, and so did Lucas. But as a routine search was being conducted, they found the white Mazda Miata. It was the make, model, and color. They contacted the police and the license plate matched. It was confirmed to be Christine's car. It was sitting in a valet parking spot, and this gave detectives hope that maybe Christine had decided to get a hotel. Maybe she was using an alias, maybe she was hiding out for a little bit, or maybe she met someone who was wining and dining her, or maybe it was something totally different. A crime scene technician showed up. They were searching for anything that they could find to lead them to Christine's whereabouts. They pulled fingerprints from all over the inside and the outside. They located a cell phone that was on the front seats, a water bottle inside, and like a movie tape. Other than that, there wasn't much for them to go on. But the fact that it looked like Christine had left her cell phone behind was puzzling and concerning. They tracked down the valet manager. He had actually been working for these hotels for 30 years, parking cars, and he remembered that car that night for many reasons. One is because the usual cars that come through are expensive, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, those types of cars. After all, this garage is designated for two very luxury hotels. A tiny older model Mazda Miata was going to stand out to him. He told detectives that he was working the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. from February 15th into the morning of the 16th. That Mazda pulled in around 5:45 in the morning and proceeded to park in a valet-only spot. The attendant started to walk over to inform the driver that that spot was reserved and they couldn't self-park. That's when the driver got out, locked the door, and started to walk away. So the attendant yelled out to them saying, "Hey, you cannot park here, it's valet." Instead of moving the car, the driver turned around, threw the keys at the attendant and yelled, "Valet." The driver was a man, it wasn't Christine, and that was horrifying for detectives to realize. Someone else had driven Christine's car and left it here early in the morning after she went missing. At first, finding Christine's car gave them hope, as I said, that maybe she was hiding out in a hotel room, but now it seemed like something even more sinister. The valet attendant said that the man walked towards the Century City Mall, and when he first encountered him, he seemed to be in a daze. That is, until he yelled at him. Then he kind of snapped out of it. The man was well dressed. He was white, in his 40s, with blondish-brownish hair with a little bit of gray in front. He was maybe 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. The entire premises was searched. Both hotels were searched. Every room was looked into. There were canines trying to track Christine's scent, but nothing turned up. By this time, the press was all over the story. Christine's picture was everywhere, and the public was paying attention again. It was making national headlines. People from all over America were captivated by her story and wanted her to be found. When Terry and Kirk were informed that her car had been found, they thought it was good news. But the way the investigators were framing it, it didn't seem like a positive sign. After the car was found and Susan Murphy had come forward, police put out another press conference, this time with additional information about the car, where it was found, and the scenario involving a woman and a stranger posing to work with Disney on a James Bond film. They were careful not to reveal any of the identities of the witnesses, but they did put out the composite sketch, as well as this statement from Terry. She said, "I was elated that they found the car and that this would be a clue to Christine's whereabouts. But Christine was not found. And I was, of course, disappointed. We're making progress, and I know that the Santa Monica Police Department is working around the clock on this effort. They have continued to reassure me that they have all the resources to find Christine, and I have absolute faith in them. It is very disturbing and horrific to think that there's a man that has captured my daughter. For me to think about the type of situation that she may be in, it's absolutely overpowering. I can't think about it. We'll find her, no matter what is happening to her. We will find her." And then she begged the person who had Christine to please release her gently. So it hurts to think that there are parents like Christine's out there that are truly suffering in these moments. The detectives finally received an itemized breakdown of all the purchases that were made on Christine's debit card. At 1:33 p.m. at Bloomingdale's, 2 pairs of sheer hosiery brand pantyhose, which came to $25, and a $185 white button-down collared blouse, for a total of $226.24. Then the next charge at 1:36 p.m. was right across from Bloomingdale's at the Guest store, a black mini skirt for $73.61. Finally, at 2:15 p.m., she bought a pair of Ellie brand size 9 6-inch black heels with straps on the ankles for $54.13. If you haven't put it together yet, it's the exact outfit that Susan Murphy was told to wear to the fake James Bond casting. The exact items. After they made this connection, it was almost as though they knew they had him. It had to be the same person. But they went back to interview Christine's roommate, Carrie. They wanted to ask specific questions, things that may have been overlooked since the time she heard that her roommate was missing. They recalled how detailed Carrie was at explaining what Christine had been wearing and what she purchased the weekend before. The blue corduroys, the matching shirt. They wanted to see if Christine had shown her her most recent purchase and if she could remember anything, no matter how small it may be. I think the pressure is on when your friend has now been missing for 2 weeks. Carrie was eager to help, and sure enough, she said yes. She said that when Christine was getting ready to leave that Saturday morning, she had initially told Carrie that she was just kind of hanging out that day, window shopping. But when she came back around 2:45 in the afternoon, she had an entirely different demeanor. She was super excited, rushing around and thinking hard about exactly what happened. When Christine came in the door that day, she reported that she recalled Christine saying she was on her way to an audition for a new project that was just starting. They wanted a new face, someone who wasn't stick thin, and that she was perfect. She thought it might have been a James Bond film. Christine mentioned something about it being a fast turnaround, and that she was going to have to start filming in a week, and needed to get a passport because some of the scenes were overseas. Carrie probably didn't know to pay close attention to everything because she had no idea Christine would never be heard from again, but she was racking her brain. She told detectives that Christine mentioned if she landed this role, she would be the lead actress and make upwards of like $100,000. But she needed to hurry to get to this impromptu audition by 5:30, and she already had the outfit, which she described as sexy and sultry, to show off a lot of leg. Detectives were pleased with the detail that Carrie was providing. They pressed her regarding the actual outfit that Christine was in possession of. Did she show her? She said yes. It was a white long-sleeve shirt with a pointed collar that buttoned up, a black lycra-style mini-skirt, patent leather black 6-inch heels, and sheer pantyhose. Carrie told the detectives that Christine had actually tried all of it on when she got home. She could hardly walk in the heels because they were so high. Christine mentioned that this was not something she would usually wear, but she understood that they wanted her to look a certain way. The last thing that Carrie recalls Christine saying was that the meeting was in a really nice part of Beverly Hills and that a group of women were going to be called out there, but she was told she was at the top of the list. It was all adding up to exactly what Susan Murphy had dreaded. Detectives asked Carrie what Christine thought of this whole thing, and she said that Christine had some doubts but kept saying, "What if it's real? But what if it wasn't?" They also got video footage of Christine at Bloomingdale's. What they don't have is footage of her running into anyone. They scoured hours of footage but couldn't find anything that showed her talking to a stranger. Let me set the stage for the next big lead. It's February 26th. Marianne Larios is at home watching the Wednesday news and she sees a composite sketch. Even though most of us laugh at these sketches because they usually look so bad, Marianne was a parole officer. She was familiar with all of her parolees. She knew their charges, their stories, and about what they'd done in the past. She had time to study their faces at each appointment. She knew she was looking at one of her parolees. His name was Victor Paleologus. He had just recently been paroled on January 20th, 2003, about a month before Christine went missing. Marianne wasted no time. She called the police with this information. Even though she wasn't 100% sure it was him, she said it looked very similar, and the charges against him and the things he had done in the past pointed in his direction. First, they ran this guy's name, and it turns out he was already in custody in a Los Angeles County jail for grand theft auto. His arrest date was February 17th, 2003, 2 days after Christine was last seen. So he very well could be their guy. Victor Thomas was the name that the strange man gave Susan Murphy. Coincidence on the first name? I don't think so, but cops aren't so sure. That would mean that 2 weeks after he got out of jail, he was already planning this elaborate scheme and carrying it out. That, well, they don't know who they're dealing with, and I wish I didn't either. As they dig deeper, the address on his record matched a restaurant on La Seneca Boulevard, the exact location where he told Susan to meet him. Plus, he was what they referred to in California as a 290. That's the penal code for someone convicted of a sex crime. How much more information do they need? Well, as much as they can get. The first conviction on Victor's record was back in the fall of 1989. It happened in Manhattan Beach. It's a very popular beach town where people come to enjoy the sunshine and nightlife. One of those people was Christine Kaludyan, an up-and-coming actress, only 21 years old at the time. A man approached Christine at a bar and complimented her dark hair and hazel eyes. Introducing himself as John Maroney, he said he was a music executive for Columbia Records. He went on to invite her to an exclusive VIP party in downtown LA. It was going to be at a luxury hotel, a presidential suite. Madonna would be there, among a ton of other celebrities. It's not uncommon for these parties to take place, and it's pretty normal for people to invite you to come along. It sounded like fun to Christine. The man was around her age, he wasn't bad looking, and he was a smooth talker, so she agreed to go. He told her he would pick her up the next day in a limo. On October 24th, the guy showed up at Christine's place, but in a car, not a limousine. That was a little bit disappointing and should have been a major red flag, but he insisted there was a mix-up and they'd be fine. They'd be at the hotel with the A-listers in no time. But first, they had some time to kill, so they stopped at a club to have a few drinks. Finally, they left for the Bonaventure Hotel. Just look at this place. It's been featured in many Hollywood productions, TV shows, and movies. True Lies was filmed in their famous elevators that go all the way up to the 35th floor. Christine was being taken up on one, hoping to rub elbows with the stars. When they walked inside the room, though, it was empty. There was no party, and nothing was happening. Christine was confused. She was like, "What's going on?" And then, without warning, she figured it out because this man lunged towards her, trying to kiss her and grope her. She, of course, pushed him away and said, "This is not what I agreed to. What are you doing?" Then he threw her down on the bed and started to rip at her clothing. She fought back. She wouldn't stop. He was holding her down and yelled, "I just wanted you for sex." And he kept going. He was pulling her pantyhose off, and then out of nowhere he reached behind the bed frame and pulled out a rope that was tied to the bed. This was 100% planned. He knew he was going to do this probably even before he chose Christine. He tried to grab her hands and tie her up, but she kept resisting. She was kicking and screaming. She was able to get free long enough to race to the bathroom, but he was quick on her heels and wasn't fast enough to shut the door. He grabbed her legs and dragged her back to the bed. They continued to fight, and he finally put her in a chokehold, whispering to her that if she stayed calm and stopped fighting and just let him tie her up, he would let her go. She struggled to break free, but he was able to grab onto a belt from her dress and rip it off her. He then tried using it to tie her hands behind her back. Clearly, he was attempting to get her in a very vulnerable position where he could have his way with her, while she just lay there subdued. But she kept kicking and kicking. Finally, the belt flew from his hands. He then grabbed his own necktie, ripped it off, and again tried to tie Christine's hands behind her back. At this point, she thought he was going to win. She was face down on the bed. She knew she couldn't give up. She had to give it her all, or she might die. So she gathered up all the strength she had left and used it to jump up as fast as she could. She ran through the door and into the hotel hallway, desperately pounding on every door until one opened a crack. A man cautiously peered out while she was screaming, "Please let me in. This man is trying to, you know what?" It was obvious from her appearance. She was disheveled, her clothes were torn. The man led her inside and she called the police. They were there within minutes. After gathering all the information from Christine, they were able to track down the man who rented the hotel room. None other than Victor Paleologos. He was arrested and charged with attempted forcible sexual intercourse and battery with the intent to force himself on her, as well as false imprisonment using violence. If you're wondering how he could afford a presidential suite while stealing, obviously, he was actually convicted for stealing people's information and taking out credit cards in their name. That same year at trial, Victor pleaded not guilty. He insisted Christine had willingly come with him into his hotel room and that she consented to being intimate. He claimed she became angry at some point about something and tried to leave. He said there was a minor argument, and he tried to claim that he was attempting to calm her down. He explained that she had a strappy purse which wound around her wrist, and when he went to grab it, she pulled back, causing what appeared to be rope burns. The jury was not convinced, but because it was his word against hers, ultimately Victor took a plea deal. He said it would cost $30,000 for him to go through another trial, so he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of false imprisonment. He also had his former employer at a bank he worked for send a letter to the judge. The letter talked about Victor's character, stating that he was a loyal employee and that charging him with a felony would jeopardize his ability to continue his employment. The letter urged the court to reduce the charge to a misdemeanor, and it was granted. I can't believe it. Here was this guy getting away with this, walking away with only 3 years of probation. Well, guess what? The letter wasn't even real. Later, it was revealed that Victor forged that letter. In actuality, his boss said he was a terrible employee and suspected him of stealing from the company. Ever since he got fired, the thefts stopped. In 1991, Victor struck again. These were only the documented times he tried to lure women with false pretenses. This time it was a woman named Elizabeth Davis. They met at the airport and he approached her saying he was a Disney producer. He invited her to a dinner party, claiming there would be a casting for a James Bond movie. She agreed to meet him at the restaurant later. They were having some cocktails, but when she looked away, he put something into her drink. She noticed it when she turned back around. There was a white substance floating on the top of it. She excused herself, pretended to go to the restroom, but alerted the staff. They called the police, who took a report and got his information. No charges were filed against him in that case because he ran from the scene after the police showed up. By 1994, Victor was living in Marina del Rey and still on probation. At the time, a girl in his neighborhood caught his eye. They would greet each other every day, just saying hello, but then it turned into talking. Ultimately, Victor asked her on a date. Let's call her Jane. She wanted to remain anonymous. They hit it off and began a relationship, but about 6 months in, things were not working out and Jane wanted to break it off. Victor wasn't going to let that happen. First, it was the begging and the non-stop calling, leaving messages, showing up places. Then came the con. Victor told Jane he was dying of a brain tumor and didn't have much time left. He begged her not to leave him alone. Jane had a heart and gave in. She would come see him and keep him company. But all the while, Victor was running scams all over town. He was caught trying to steal almost $100,000 from a company, but once again convinced the judge to let him plead to a lesser charge. And he did for making false financial records. So again, he got off without any jail time or truly being sentenced for the real crimes that this man was committing. Just a few months later, he was arrested again and charged with grand theft auto. This time, he tried to purchase a Saab from a Century City dealership with a bad check that he stole from someone else. You're going to hear the same story again and again. He was let off once again for a lesser charge of creating false financial records. Why? Tell me, the ace up his sleeve was always plea bargains. He would go through all the legal proceedings, his lawyers were always good, he knew the law, and would wait, then swoop in and plead guilty to a lesser charge. In many cases, the court would want to hurry up and get to the next case, so it worked. By January 1996, Victor was still carrying on the dying ruse, now saying his dying wish was to open an Italian restaurant. He wanted Jane to come view this new location with him. He was going to purchase it and renovate it. It was in Brentwood, and she agreed. When she got inside, it was empty except for a few tables. So they sat down and started to talk. Then, out of nowhere, this man sprang up and attacked her. Jane was no match for him. He was able to pick her up and carry her into the bathroom, where he tried to rip away her clothing and force himself on her. She kicked and screamed loudly. He had one hand on her neck and was using the other to grope her, but she didn't give up. She kept fighting and was able to break free and run outside just as a handyman was coming into the restaurant. Victor tried to get the guy to leave, but Jane used this as her opportunity to run as fast as she could all the way to her car. Victor caught up to her, crying, begging, and apologizing for what he had done. But Jane wasn't convinced. She sped away, hoping that was the last time she would see him. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Just a month later, while she was home alone, Jane heard a noise. She crept towards her bedroom to find Victor on the floor, hiding near her bed. He had a long cord in his hands. Since the last attack, she had armed herself with pepper spray, which she grabbed on her way to investigate the noise. As soon as she tried to run, he came towards her with the cord. She unloaded the spray right into his face and ran to her neighbors to call 911. They arrived within 5 minutes, but Victor had once again escaped, stealing a handgun and a bunch of Jane's jewelry. She filed a report and wanted to press charges. An investigation was conducted, and Victor was finally tracked down when he stole another vehicle, which was later found at a hotel in Malibu. They were able to locate his room at the hotel. They told him to come out with his hands up, but he threatened to shoot himself. So they had to call in the SWAT team to get this man out. But he ended up escaping and running into a mobile home park. He was trying to find one of the doors that was unlocked and ran inside one of these homes, where the occupants were freaking out. This man would not quit. The SWAT team found the mobile home where he was hiding, but once again, he refused to come out. This went on for 3 or 4 hours until they finally were able to apprehend him. And guess what? He denied the whole thing. He said that he never broke in anywhere. He just politely asked the occupants of the mobile home to use their phone, and he was going to turn himself in. Apparently, yeah, right. At this time, he was charged with burglary, grand theft, and again false imprisonment. The trial didn't take place until 1998. Again, he pulled that ace. His lawyers told the judge to drop all charges except burglary for what he took from Jane's apartment. His deal was 6 years in prison, but the judge agreed to suspend the prison time in exchange for Victor completing probation for 104 months. Otherwise, he would have to serve time. And as you probably guessed, he thought he could keep working the system, collecting more victims. It was just a month later, in August of 1998, and he had a lot of practice now. He had his ruse down pat. It worked each time. With each new victim, he perfected it even more, accounting for any missteps he may have taken in the past. He was ready to put it into action once again. This time, at the Sky Bar in West Hollywood, his targets were attractive women in their 20s. He would try to get them to talk and see if they mentioned acting. Then, his con was that he was a high-powered producer interested in them for a new role. That night, he saw 2 women, Kimberly Harrow and 24-year-old Heather Mayer. They were leaving the bar and walking down Sunset Boulevard. He walked up to them, paying more attention to Heather, and ran his same lines, that he was a producer from Disney, interested in casting for a very specific woman for some promotions for the new James Bond movie. It's so weird. It's like Disney to soften them up with childhood memories, and James Bond to make them feel sexy, and one of the most beautiful girls in the world, a Bond girl. That's the manipulation. The project sounded pretty straightforward. The man was dressed in a suit, was well-spoken, and was put together. The way he carried himself was very convincing. Then he mentioned the rate. It would be upward of $100,000 if Heather was interested. He was putting together a little closed audition at the Ritz-Carlton on Sunday morning, but it was very private, hush-hush. She would have to come alone. Of course, Heather was excited. She said she was interested. The man told her to meet at 8:30 a.m., wearing a black mini-skirt, nude pantyhose, and black high heels. It's the same thing every time, and it's sick to think that this is his fantasy, the sexy secretary fantasy. Heather kept her promise. She showed up on time, wearing the outfit. Victor met her in the hotel lobby with a folder full of papers and laid out all the details of the job, including the pay. They looked very legit. Heather agreed to the contract. Victor was excited. He said, "Great, now all we have to do is have you meet my business partner, and then we get the go-ahead and start the project." He told Heather that he would drive her to the next location, a restaurant in Brentwood. It was the very same empty restaurant he had used before, the one he pretended he was going to renovate as his dying wish when he lied to poor Jane. Heather didn't get into his car. She agreed to follow him in her own vehicle. He escorted her into this empty restaurant, and Heather was confused. It was old, dark, and had nothing but 3 chairs set out in the middle. Victor explained that there would be a woman, his business partner, coming in shortly, and Heather asked if she could slip away to use the bathroom. She was really scoping the place out, looking for any other way out, any doors. She didn't feel right about this audition. Something just felt off, but maybe it was just not what she was used to. When she came back, Victor said, "You know what? We should spend a few minutes going over the poses for the promotional material so that you're ready for my partner." He really wanted her to get the part, so he would guide her, and she agreed. He told her to sit on the floor, cross her legs, and put her ankles very close together. This was something he emphasized, of course, because he was probably trying to tie them up real fast to keep her from kicking like the other girls had. Heather did as she was told, and just like that, he pulled out some kind of strap with a buckle on it. As you pull it, it would get tighter and tighter. He quickly slipped it around her ankles and pulled it tightly. Heather was caught off guard. She was not okay with this. She yelled for him to take it off, but instead, Victor jumped on top of her and pushed her to the ground. She fell backward. He told her to keep quiet, but Heather was like, "F that." She wasn't having it. She started to fight, just like Jane. Then he ripped off his necktie, a classic move on his part. Each time, remember, he would provide the necktie to try to tie Heather's hands behind her back. He got one of them in his grip, but she wouldn't let him get the other one. She fought as hard as she could. All of a sudden, a new move. He dropped her hand, threw the tie around her neck, but not before Heather was able to slip her hand underneath. Yes, that is exactly what they tell you to do. Release the pressure. He turned her over and sat on her back with her face into the ground and his hand around her mouth, pulling the necktie. Then he got one of his hands underneath her and pressed her butt against him in an upward position, and then began to rip at her hosiery while whispering, "I knew from the first time I saw you I couldn't control myself. Well, try these monsters. They take what they want." Poor Heather was still putting up a fight. She heard the sound of Victor taking off his belt, and then she heard a zipper. Even more frightened, she kicked her legs again and again until the belt started to give way, and she was finally free and able to get up. She made it to the door, but not before Victor grabbed her and put his body weight against it, keeping it closed. He had the audacity to tell her, "I know this must be traumatizing to you, but I'm not gonna let you leave." The fact that we get to hear the words that came out of this monster's mouth makes it even worse. Heather, thinking quickly, grabbed a hold of her sharp stiletto heel and waved it in his face like a dagger. She distracted him with that and slipped from his grip. She was finally outside and running toward her car. Thankfully, she had driven herself. She jumped in and raced away. She had no idea where she was going, and she didn't care. She just wanted to get as far away from this evil man as she could. She called 911. The police arrested Victor, and in his car was a kink set, so to speak. Lubes, vibes, dildos, rope. Yes, once again he posted bail and was out of jail until the trial in July 1999. It literally looked like this guy was going to get away with it again, just like the times before, and most of the charges were dropped. Except this time, one wasn't. The felony battery on Heather. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for that charge, on top of 6 more years for violating his probation. But why then was he out of prison in February 2003 in order to somehow be involved in Christine's disappearance? He was paroled on January 20th, 2003. He was only in prison for like 3 years. It makes me feel like women's bodies are not valuable to the justice system unless they're dead. Violations seem to be swept under the rug, and then these men are released again and again. We all know their crimes escalate. So at first, when investigators were not sure if it was possible for Victor to have come up with such an elaborate scheme by the time he saw Susan Murphy, since he only had a few days since he had gotten out, they thought wrong. He had years to perfect this scam. They didn't have to worry about catching him because he was already in jail after trying to steal a BMW X5 from Beverly Hills BMW. It's the same every time. The Saab, the other car he sold, now BMW. He thought he was real smooth, dressed to impress like a corporate executive. Victor appeared interested in purchasing a new car in cash, and in this part of LA, this happens every day. This is a very upscale area. He looked the part, and they fell for it. He gave them a fake social security number, a fake name of Robert Morton, fake bank account information, and he acted calm and collected as they checked everything out. Meanwhile, there was an attendant putting gas in a soon-to-be new car and driving it back, and that is when he intercepted this attendant. Since the attendant knew they had been working with the other employees, he didn't think twice. He just walked past Victor, letting him know that he was just going to go make sure everything checks out. But by that time, Victor had jumped into the BMW and was off. The dealership, of course, called the cops, but it wasn't long before Victor was caught. They did a little pat-down and found a wallet with a bunch of stolen licenses, stolen credit cards, IDs, blank checks with other people's names on them. These will come into play later when yet another connection is made in this huge scheme. It was time to bring Susan Murphy in and do a lineup with Victor and 5 other guys to see if she could identify him. I actually listened to her talking about this in a video, and she described it as knowing right away who he was, but that he was trying to make himself look different, like sort of giving himself a different stature, kind of lowering himself down, maybe making one arm look like it was longer than the other, just to throw her off. But it didn't work. She knew who he was right away. In a separate lineup, Susan's boyfriend Mark also picked Victor out right away. They were positive he was the guy who pretended to be a Disney executive to lure Susan into some building on La Seneca Boulevard. That same building was the abandoned restaurant called Cafe Milano. It was an Italian restaurant where Victor used to be an employee. He and another man purchased it together to renovate it. It was a millionaire businessman who was the owner of a property investment company. He was probably scammed by Victor too. So they did a third lineup, but these were paper lineups. They were just pictures. This wasn't in person, and this was the valet attendant. They would show them 6 pictures of men, one of whom was Victor. Unfortunately, he was not able to make a correct identification. He had only seen the man in the parking lot for a few seconds. It wasn't long enough for him to study his facial features. But there was a new witness who came forward. By Wednesday, February 26th, after the same composite sketch had been put in the media, this is where I told you things would really connect. It was a real estate broker named Paul Cady. He recognized the sketch as a man he had shown a number of luxury properties to. He told the detectives the man walked into a Santa Monica office off La Cienega at 7:30 p.m. on February 7th. He told him he wanted to buy a home in his price range, which was $500,000 to $750,000. And he wanted to move in fast because he was expanding his company called Logos Corporation. Logos, the last part of Victor's last name. Paul said it was too late for him to start showing him anything that day, but said that he would be glad to do it on Saturday at 11 o'clock. So that day, Paul drove Victor up to Laurel Canyon. This is a really nice area. It is way up these winding roads in the hills. The roads are so narrow, it's almost like one way, but it's actually not. And just look at these homes, they're absolutely gorgeous. Paul showed Victor a really beautiful home on Wonderland Avenue, and then another one on Skyline Drive. While they were there, they spotted an open house. It was on the same road. This house was really unique, and Victor took interest in it right away. It was at 8583 Skyline Drive. It had an outside enclosed patio out front, parallel to the street, and it was at a dead-end road on the end of Skyline Drive, where the road came to a point with a lookout and a view of Los Angeles. It was very pretty. The realtor mentioned that there were also some hiking trails in this area and showed Victor that this is where the locals would go hiking. He seemed very interested in this more secluded, dead-end residence. The home was spectacular and had a big back patio with a very impressive design, but Victor still wanted to look at some other properties, so they left and went to a few more homes. This routine continued a few more times, with Paul spending the whole day catering to Victor, picking him up and taking him all around. On Tuesday, February 11th, Paul once again picked him up from the Century Plaza Hotel and took him to see maybe 6 or 7 more homes. After leaving one in particular, Paul got word that the owner was missing his credit card and his driver's license, but he would never suspect that his client did it. They again met on Wednesday the 12th, Thursday the 13th, and even the 14th. On Valentine's Day, Christine went missing. The next day, Paul also reported that Victor acted really strangely in each one of these homes. After walking into a closet and closing the door, he would scream and then ask the real estate agent if he could hear him. Victor said he was allegedly checking how soundproof the house was for music production and film, but the detectives found this information very chilling. Paul said that February 15th was one of the only days he didn't meet up with Victor, but they did meet on Sunday evening to continue looking at homes. Paul finally dropped him off at a store around 8:40 p.m. The next day, it was time for Victor and Paul to sit down and draw up an offer for one of the homes, so they met again to go over the contract. When he was going to drop Victor off in the evening around 6 at the hotel, Victor made a remark that he was sick of not having his own vehicle. He asked if there was a Mercedes or BMW dealership nearby, and Paul said yes, so he dropped him off at Beverly Hills BMW. We know that's where he stole the SUV and was apprehended. He also stole from all the homes that Paul was showing him. That is how he was able to afford hotels, food, and nice clothing. It was a vicious cycle. He even stole from hotel guests. That day, they got a search warrant for Victor's clothing that he was wearing when he was booked into jail. They wanted to search every home that Victor toured because the clothing might contain evidence related to the crime, and the suspect may have used one of these locations to commit a crime against Christine Johnson. Detective O'Pinchain also said she believed, based on the above-stated facts, that Victor was involved in the abduction and/or murder of Christine Johnson. They also got a warrant for the restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard. Apparently, this is where Victor was living. They collected every piece of evidence they could find. Investigators found stolen ID cards and keys. In addition, they obtained Victor's computer and analyzed the hard drive. That's when they discovered disturbing images of women depicted in white-collared shirts, black skirts, nylons, and stilettos. Exactly what the casting agent said to wear to these James Bond auditions. While her family prayed for her safe return, 12 days had passed without significant results. To honor Christine, her loved ones held 2 vigils, one in her hometown and the other in the capital city, to celebrate her 22nd birthday. People from all over joined in to show their support and bring attention to the search for Christine. It was such a heartbreaking moment. So much was going on behind the scenes, and everyone was hoping to find Christine. Maybe she was being held somewhere, and they thought Victor was the only person who could tell them where she was and what happened to her. Detective O'Pinchain had another detective go speak with Victor, thinking maybe a man would be able to get through to him better than a woman, since Victor clearly had no respect for them. Detective Henry went out to the jail to talk to Victor and right away told him, "Listen, I'm not here on your current charges about the BMW. I'm hoping you could help me with something else. I'm with the missing persons unit and I need help finding this girl." He put a photo of Christine right in front of Victor. Before even giving this photo a glance, Victor said, "No." He went on to say, "Oh, I've seen all the reports on the news. I don't know her and I haven't seen her." Detective John Henry lied. He said a witness had seen Victor with Christine. He kind of wanted Victor to think that maybe they were just trying to get information and weren't suspecting he had anything to do with it. So he said, "Come on, maybe you saw her in passing. It's a big city, lots of people. Just let me know. Just take one more look at the picture and tell me if you've ever run into her anywhere. I just really need your help." But it didn't work. Right then, Victor asked for an attorney and refused to speak with Detective Henry. But that didn't stop Henry from talking to him. He pleaded with him, saying, "Come on, you're not in trouble. We just need to speak with anyone who could have seen her because she could be in danger." Victor told him he was a parolee and wouldn't risk anything because he didn't trust the cops, and they were most likely trying to set him up for something he didn't do. Detective Henry tried to go the sympathetic route. He said, "Imagine it's your mom or your sister. Wouldn't you want to help? Wouldn't you want someone to talk if they had seen something?" But this wasn't working on him either, because all he cared about was himself, and that was obvious. They were able to find out some information about him from his past. He was born in 1962 in Pennsylvania. He seemed to have a normal, loving family and upbringing, the youngest of 5 brothers. He went to college, got a bachelor's degree in New Mexico, and then headed out to LA for his MBA. They actually found no record of his graduate studies. This is just what he said. He was married from 1990 until 1993. That was the same time he met Elizabeth Davis and tried to poison her in 1991. It's interesting that he was able to hold down some relationships, though he failed at the restaurant business. We know the rest. He had the woe is me type of personality, like the world was against him. but he did end up providing them with an alibi. He explained that he spent the evening at home before heading out to IHOP to meet a friend. When his friend was able to back up the story, the police were worried that they'd come to another dead end. Yet they knew Victor still had enough time to meet up with Christine after he ate with his friend at IHOP. An in-person lineup had been scheduled for Monday, March 3rd. Terry was making her rounds on all the networks, trying to keep Christine's face in the media. Meanwhile, search efforts had been halted because there were downpours happening. A violent storm had come through, one that LA doesn't usually see. Southern California is known for its lack of rainfall, but these forceful downpours were bringing a bunch of mud down the slopes surrounding Hollywood. It made it very hard for people to get out there and search safely, and they didn't even know where to put their efforts until another person came forward with vital information. Another concerned citizen from the Laurel Canyon area, named Douglas Kirkland, called the police to say he recognized Christine from the pictures in the news. He told the detectives that Christine was lost in Hollywood Hills on February 15th and that she flagged him down in front of his residence. She asked for directions to what she was referring to as the Castle House. At first, the man said he had no idea what Christine was talking about, but his wife was outside and overheard the conversation. She said, "I know where there's a castle-like house." She pointed Christine towards the home around 5:30 p.m. "We know she called 411 around the same time." Then another witness called in. Her name was Kathy Devano. She was a Hollywood actress, best known for her role on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. She said that she saw the composite sketch and it looked like a man who had approached her at Century City Mall around 1998 or 1999. She told investigators his name was Brian Cathay, an executive at Disney. He complimented her on her legs and told her she would be the perfect model for their James Bond poster. How many women did he do this to? Kathy offered to give him her agent's phone number, but Victor told her that he would rather not have to deal with an agent that way. She could keep more of the money if she got the role on her own. Kathy said he wanted her to leave them all right then and there, but she knew better than that. She asked him for a business card, and he handed her this old beat-up card but wouldn't let her keep it because he said it was his last one. Instead, she just wrote down all the information and gave it to her agent. The man told Kathy to wear a white button-down shirt, black skirt, nylon stockings, and stilettos. Her agent contacted Disney and verified that the man was a fake. The person who answered the phone was Brian from Disney, but he quickly let the agent know he was not the man from the mall. Brian urged the agent to inform their client not to attend the audition. He was empathetic and reiterated that he was not in the mall and had not given Kathy a business card. Further, he said someone may have his business card and was passing it off as their own. But Kathy still drove to Laurel Canyon to meet this guy. She brought a stuntman from Deep Space Nine. The guy told her to wait in her car, and she did as she was instructed, but he never arrived. It sucks because all of this is circumstantial. They still don't know where Christine is. So Monday came, and Victor was going to be put in a lineup with other men, and witnesses were going to try to pick him out. Interestingly, Victor had grown out his beard since he had been arrested, and the detectives knew that this could be a way to throw off their witnesses. So they asked the jail to have Victor shave, but he wouldn't. They actually had to get a court order to shave this man's face because he would not shave his beard on his own. Susan, Mark, and the valet attendant were all asked separately which man they believed was the person they knew as a suspect. Just like before, Susan and Mark picked Victor, but the valet attendant couldn't choose the correct individual. He explained he didn't get a good look at him. It was 3 p.m. when it was finished. And O'Pinchin's phone rang. Right away, she knew it wasn't good. A few hours earlier, 4 teenage boys were smoking cigarettes and hanging out, walking down Skyline Drive, high up in the hills. They walked all the way to the end where the pavement stops and were looking over all of Los Angeles, just taking in the view. One of the boys walked closer to the edge and looked down. The drop was a few hundred feet, but about 80 feet down, something looked off among all the green. He saw something blue. He told his friends it looked weird, and they all started to peer over into this narrow ravine full of mud and thick brush. They thought they could make out the shape of a body. It looked like a mannequin. One of the boys started to make his way down there little by little to get a closer look, but it didn't take him long to turn back and yell that it looked like a dead body. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have cell phones, so they walked down Skyline Drive and saw a man outside gardening. He said he didn't have a phone with him. They walked back to the edge of the ravine, pacing and trying to think of what to do. A woman, let's call her Sally, who lived in the area about a mile away off Morris Skull Drive, was walking her 3 dogs like she did every day. She crossed this road right here on Wonderland Park Avenue, went down Skyline Drive past the Castle House, and went up to the 8500 block where the lookout was. That's when she saw the boys huddled near the edge of the ravine. As she got closer, one of the boys said they thought there was a body down below. Sally jumped into action. She tied her dogs up and made her way down that ravine, carefully balancing herself as she tried to get a closer look. There it was, a body lying on its right side. The legs were covered with a blue fabric, and the head was facing down the slope. On top of the head was a gray hoodie covering the neck and the shoulders. Sally could see that their hands were tied behind their back, and there was a scrunchie on their right wrist. The body was folded into a sort of fetal position. The person was not clothed from the waist down except for ripped pantyhose, and the buttocks area was exposed. They appeared to be wearing a gray shirt that was pulled up in the back, exposing the midsection. Some hair was sticking out from the hoodie, and she could tell it was dirty blonde. Sally didn't know what to think. It was a lot to take in. She didn't see any blood or wounds at all, but she knew this was most likely the body of a deceased female. Sally took note that the body probably would have gone unnoticed had it not hit a tree stump on the way down, trapping it in a more visible position. Sally quickly left, called the police, and waited until the LAPD arrived on the scene. As she waited, she realized that this could be the missing girl she had seen on TV, and she couldn't hold in that sadness. Witnessing something like this was not easy. She cried and let the cops take over the scene. She then made her way back home in shock, especially since this was so close to where she lived. But was this Christine Johnson? Detectives think it is, especially because the realtor, Paul Cady, had brought Victor right to this house off the 8500 block of Skyline Drive, the one he seemed so intrigued by, 8583 Skyline Drive, at the dead end right before the lookout, right near a ravine. As Detective John Henry made his way down there, he was hoping it wasn't Christine, but there was too much adding up. He made his way down and saw the blue sleeping bag, and just below it, there were a pair of feet sticking out with black stiletto heels on them. That's when he felt his stomach drop. He knew it was Christine. The shirt was white but had become dirty with the rains and the mud. He could tell that her hands and ankles were tied with white shoelaces. On her exposed midsection was a lower back tattoo of a hibiscus flower. They had found her, but the identification was not official. They had the difficult task of retrieving her body from this very dangerous location, while also preserving as much evidence as possible. It was going to take a lot of work. It took hours and a team of experienced rescue workers, and they carefully put her inside a body bag to preserve any clothing that she had on. They slowly lowered a basket down, put the body inside, and labeled her Jane Doe 22 until she could be formally identified. Unbelievable. She was hoisted up over the ridge and put on a gurney to be transported to the medical examiner's office. Now they had to notify Christine's parents. At this moment, her mom, Terry, was on a flight to New York, so they called her father, Kirk. As soon as he answered, the chief of police asked him if he was home and if anyone was there with him. He said, "Yes, I'm here with my wife." As soon as he heard that question, he knew he was probably going to get bad news. The chief continued by saying, "I'm very sorry, we found Christine, but she's no longer with us." Kirk's life flashed before him, all the memories of his daughter being born, her childhood, it was all shattered. It was too much to take in. He ran outside, looked into the sky, and cried, "Christine." Then he just said, "I love you, I love you, I love you." And at that point, he knew she was in heaven. Terry got the news soon after she landed. She was equally upset and torn apart, and she knew she had to turn right back around and come back to California. Before the autopsy was conducted, the body was taken to the Forensic Science Center. This is where they collected all the evidence. They took off all the clothes and accessories and bagged them for analysis. It was in the middle of the night into March 4th. Now, Opinchain was there watching the entire procedure, taking notes of everything she observed. Here are a few things they found. Her shoes were scuffed in a way that showed she was dragged at one point, and they grazed across the road. She had blisters on her feet from the shoes being a bit too small and narrow. Her hands and ankles were tied with white Converse sneaker shoelaces. When they removed the gray sweatshirt from on top of her head, it was unbelievable. Her face didn't even resemble a face. It was just all black, dead tissue, unlike the rest of her body. Sadly, insects had gotten to that portion, and it was just devastating to see that. When Opinchain saw that she still had pantyhose on, she thought that maybe this meant someone didn't force themselves on her, because they would have had to take the time to put those pantyhose back on. However, they did collect DNA evidence that may still be on or in her body. The autopsy was conducted on March 5th by Dr. Lisa Scheinen. Opinchain and another detective were present at the LA coroner's office. Here's what the doctor observed. The victim's face and head had been severely decomposed due to several factors. One was the position of the body. Because the head was laying straight down, blood pooled in that area. And then there were the elements. There were wounds that aren't apparent without medical knowledge. Some were post-mortem, meaning after death, but there was one that was determined to be perimortem, happening on the brink of death as she lay dying. She had bruising on the outer part of her pelvis and hips, and there was evidence of recent sexual activity. The sample still had to be analyzed for DNA, though. The remarks on both of her wrists from the shoelaces and a very large bruise on the upper left part of her arm near the elbow indicated that someone had forcefully grabbed her here. She had bruises on her right and left calf, as well as both knees, and in her buttocks area on the left. It was evident that she put up a violent fight for her life. Her left ear was no longer attached to her scalp, but the most significant finding was the perimortem injury. Bruising to her skull behind her left ear, and bruising to the front portion of her throat, but the bones in her neck were not broken, which is what they usually see in strangulation cases. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, but the cause was still unknown. There were other tests needed to carry out, such as toxicology tests and an examination of all her organs. Her final official identification was done by matching her teeth to dental records. This poor woman. I can't imagine the horror that she had to endure. And they still needed to connect Victor to this murder. They still did not have any evidence directly linking him to this crime. However, as they went through his phone records, they noticed several calls made to a number around 11:30 p.m. the night that Christine was killed. They tracked down this person, let's call him Joey. He was 32, married, and worked at a pharmacy off Santa Monica Boulevard in La Cienega. Detectives paid him a visit. Joey was actually Victor's alibi. He had been contacted by phone briefly when Detective Henry was interviewing Victor in jail. Joey was the one to confirm that he was with Victor at IHOP that night. But now detectives wanted to know everything he knew about his friend Victor. Joey looked scared and told detectives he didn't know him well at all. They had met on January 24th of that year, and Joey was just a handyman. He worked for some buildings in the area, including the abandoned restaurant. He was there to tidy it up, and that is where he met Victor. The landlord was his old business partner's son, and he really wanted him to leave. But there was a history there. They were trying to be nice and give him a place to stay until he got back on his feet. Later, it was found out that Victor had actually lied to them about why he was in prison. They thought it had to do with some bad financial decisions, not sex crimes. Anyway, Victor was nice to Joey, and they talked and exchanged numbers just in case they needed anything. And that time came on Saturday, February 15th. At some point, they made plans to meet at IHOP at 11:30 p.m. They had gone there together before. Joey said he got there and waited for Victor to arrive, but he wasn't there yet. Victor called him 3 times to tell him he was running behind. The first time he said he was with someone and driving there and would be there soon. Then he called again around 11:30 and then at midnight to update Joey on his arrival, saying, "Okay, I'm making my way over." When he called that third time right before midnight, he said he was walking up. Joey noticed that he came from a different direction than he usually did. It wasn't the direction of where he knew Victor was living. He wasn't in a car being dropped off, like he said he would be. At the time, Joey didn't think much of it, but now he's telling the detectives everything that stood out to him. They ordered some food, and while they waited, Joey noticed that there were 3 red scratches, like welts, above Victor's right eyebrow. He asked him what happened. Victor said, "Oh, just some furniture fell on top of me. No big deal." They were there until after 1 in the morning, and that is when Victor asked a question that was kind of out of character. He wanted to know if he could spend the night at Joey's. They weren't far from Victor's place, but it wasn't that comfortable, so Joey was like, "I don't want to be rude." They took the city bus to Joey's off Sunset and Grower Street. They boarded the bus, and Joey said it was weird because he sat in the front, but Victor went all the way to the back, which he thought was a bit odd because it wasn't full. Joey showed him to the living room couch where he could sleep that night, and Victor said, "Please wake me up at like 4:30 in the morning because I want to catch the early morning mass at Good Shepherd Church in Beverly Hills." Joey said they had some coffee together real early, around 4 or 4:30, and then Victor left by 5 or 5:30. He just walked out the front door. Detectives went to that church. Not only was there no 6:30 a.m. mass on the weekends, but when they showed a picture of Victor to everybody that worked there, and all the members, he wasn't one of them. After all this, O'Pinchain had a theory about what she believed happened to Christine. She believes Christine bumped into Victor at Century City Mall. He approached her just like he'd done with all the other women who came forward. He complimented her, carried himself professionally, said the right things, and offered her a last-minute audition. He told her to meet him that evening at 5:30 at the house off Skyline Drive that looked like a castle. It's an easier landmark to find than perhaps the house on Skyline Drive. Who knows? But he gave her directions and told her exactly what she needed to wear: a white blouse, black mini skirt, black heels, and sheer pantyhose. Poor Christine wanted so badly for this to be her big break. She may have been a bit apprehensive, but on the other hand, she was in Century City, which is the area where all the producers and agencies are based, so it made sense she was in a logical location to be discovered. Christine walked away feeling like this could be her chance to become the next Bond girl. With her mother's permission, she bought whatever she wanted at the mall and spared no expense. This footage shows her in Bloomingdale's purchasing the pantyhose and the $185 blouse. She probably figured that if she landed this role, she would have more than enough money to make up for this purchase. She wanted to look her best, to stand out and make an impression. She knew she might only get one shot, so she rushed and gathered all those items she needed. Her last stop was trashy lingerie because the shoes at the mall were probably pretty expensive. Getting some stilettos at a lingerie store seemed like it would be a better price. Then she rushed home, bumping into Lucas out front, telling him she's excited and in a hurry, and then telling Carrie all about her encounter, including modeling the outfit she was supposed to wear. Her roommate had never seen Christine so excited about anything. Most likely, it was the promise of a $100,000 paycheck that contributed to that. Then she packed up her outfits, got into her car, and headed out for the Hollywood Hills, a glamorous area filled with stars and big-time producers. This is the point where Christine's hopes and dreams seemed like they were going to come true. All that was left to do was find the castle house that had been described to her. Well, I'm going to tell you that this area is very hard to navigate. The roads loop all around, they're steep and narrow, and the signs are hidden sometimes by overgrown trees and brush. I found the castle house. It's located at 2502 Green Valley Drive. It's a sight to see. Built in 1954, the last time it was sold was in 1972 for only $50,000. Now it's appraised at $2.5 million. Opin Chain believes that Victor was waiting outside of this house for Christine when she pulled up. He most likely asked to get in her car and then directed her to drive up Skyline Drive to this dead end, which is now where this house sits, on the 8500 block of Skyline Drive. High above the hills, on the edge of a ravine, Opin Chain thinks that maybe he had watched the real estate agent type in the number to open this outside gate right here. Maybe the door to the inside of the home was unlocked because the house was empty. It was being shown to prospective buyers. Maybe he guided her onto that patio and had the audition there. We don't know, but at some point she changed into that outfit and probably did what he had done to many women who came before her, made her pose and ended up using shoelaces, which he probably prepared beforehand, to tie her hands and ankles together. But she fought. One theory that Opin Chain had was that this happened inside of her car. I think it most likely happened inside the house or out on the patio. Either way, her car was involved because that's where the blue sleeping bag came from. I just think that her screams would have echoed too much outside or in a car, but I could be wrong. Either way, she is fighting back, and that's when he goes to an even further extreme than he had in the past. He puts his hands around her neck, and she passes out. He thinks that he's killed her, so he puts her in a sleeping bag. It belonged to her older brother, and he throws her off the edge of the ravine, mere feet from the home that he had been shown on the dead end of Skyline Drive. She was most likely alive when this happened, and it was the skull fracture that caused her to be unable to move, later passing away from her injuries from the impact she sustained when she hit the tree on her way down. Who knows how long she was with him before this attack? How long he waited before he threw her body over that cliff? It most likely happened when it got dark. We know from previous stories that he sometimes had these women for hours practicing the poses. If they started at 6, they could have gone until 9. It would have been dark then. He got into Christine's car and drove away. The time between this and 11, when he calls his friend Joey, is unclear. But Opin Chain thinks that he drove Christine's car to IHOP and parked it in a back lot where Joey wouldn't be able to see it. Then he got out and walked out front to meet him, which is why he came from a different direction than usual. He left Christine's car there, took the bus with Joey, woke up really early, caught the bus, not to church but back to IHOP, got Christine's car, and then parked it in the hotel parking lot. The valet attendant said that the car came in at 5:45 a.m., and from there he probably just took the bus back to where he was living. It sounds plausible. March 7th, yet another woman came forward, Alice Walker. She told detectives that she met a man named Victor Ippolito. She was waitressing at Houston's in the very same mall the same day that he met up with Susan at Century City Mall. He was dressed in a blue business suit with a tie, and they just had some friendly talk. He said he had just moved from New York to California and was staying at the Century Plaza Hotel. Alice had just moved from Illinois. She was an English major but wanted to take a shot at acting. He told her that he was actually publishing a book, and that piqued her interest. She found him attractive, and they were flirting with each other a little bit. She was enjoying the interaction, so he asked her if she would like to hang out after she got off at 11, and she said sure. He told her to meet him in the lobby of the Century Plaza. She actually showed up only a few blocks away. They sat down and talked for 4 hours. I can't even believe that, but they were really hitting it off. They were chatting about their future plans, about projects he was working on, and the business he was trying to start, CODIS Corporation. But first, he was working on that book I told you about, a book about a guy named Vincent. Now listen to this. He said it's about a guy who gets a divorce and then wants to start a restaurant. So he borrows a bunch of money, but he can't pay it back, so he hires a lawyer. Then he goes to a party with that lawyer, and his lawyer meets some girl. He tries to have sex with her in his car, but he ends up strangling her to death. Then the lawyer tries to pin it on this man, Vincent. Now you know why one of Opin Chain's theories is that Christine was killed in her car. But of course, this conversation would have been foreshadowing, because it happened prior to Victor meeting Christine. But what about the James Bond audition? Well, he didn't exactly offer that to Alice. He said that his friend was the director and they were looking for a girl, but she had to have a really strong look. She had to have really strong legs. He wasn't sure Alice fit that description, but she told him, well, I was a ballerina for years, so he actually grabbed a hold of her calves to see if they were strong. He told her that the Bond girl character in this film was going to be a dominatrix, and that there were going to be all of these shots basically focusing on her legs. Alice believed him. She really thought he was legit. She bought all of the items that he requested, specifically nylons that sparkled like diamonds. Those were his words. She went home, got a couple of hours of sleep, bought the items, and then met him at that same abandoned restaurant on La Cienega Boulevard around 2 p.m. on Sunday, January 26th. He did the same routine as before, made her do a bunch of poses, and put the necktie around her neck, but he didn't tighten it up or anything. Hours went by and she said, I gotta go to work. Is this audition gonna happen today? He said, let me check. She changed back into her regular clothes, and when she came out, he said, listen, I'm really sorry, but we're gonna have to cancel the audition. Sean Connery is sick. I'll call you and we can reschedule for later in the week. Unbelievably, just 3 days later, on Wednesday, he called, and she met him again at 5 p.m. Same routine, but this time he tried kissing her. His excuse was that it was just part of the rehearsal, but she got angry, and this caused a little tiff between them. But he apologized, saying he was so sorry, he just really wanted her to get this part. She met him 2 or 3 more times for dinner but said it wasn't romantic. They just hung out and talked. She connected him with this case because of the corporation name CODIS. When she questioned him about the meaning of it, he lied and told her that it was his last name, Ippolito Logos, and that was just too similar to Victor Paleologos. The story too, it just seemed too coincidental. That's why she came forward. After this, Alice and Victor talked a few more times on the phone. He told her he was in the middle of buying a house in Hollywood Hills for $2.5 million, and she should come see it, but she declined. When there was no more talk about the audition, Alice pretty much had no more interest in talking to him. He did try calling her on February 15th. He left a voicemail. The number was traced back to a payphone in the Century City Mall. She, too, picked Victor out of a lineup of photos without hesitation. And this wasn't the last woman to come forward. There were others. There was a woman named Laura Hayden who came forward and told them that she met him at Lookout Mountain in Hollywood Hills, near a home with a for sale sign back in 2000. Same story again and again for about 8 women from 1991 to 2003. They were still waiting on that DNA analysis. So far, there was no foreign DNA found under Christine's fingernails, and all the evidence tested from the Castle House and the other homes Victor visited, plus the abandoned restaurant, nothing matched anything of Christine's. By the end of April, toxicology came back negative. Her death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head and neck. The compression of the neck resulted in internal bleeding and asphyxia. By May 12th, District Attorney Eleanor Hunt filed charges against Victor for first-degree murder. He was eligible for the death penalty. By February 2004, Victor had a defense attorney, and he insisted to the media that his client was innocent, that there was no DNA linking him to this crime. However, there were phone records. At 1:09 p.m. on February 15th, a call went out from Victor's cell phone, and it was traced to a tower that covered the Century City Mall, putting him at the same location that Christine was at. When they traced the 3 calls Victor made to Joey that night, guess where they were pinging off towers? They serviced the Laurel Canyon area and Hollywood Hills. But it still didn't prove that he killed Christine, and that was the hardest part. There were no phone calls between Christine and Victor. No security footage from the places that she went in the mall showing anyone near her. And since Victor didn't have a car, they were having a hard time figuring out how he would have gotten up to the Castle House to begin with. No taxis were working that route, and certainly no buses. The defense was also planning to challenge the time of death by using insects found on Christine's body. The prosecution had to come up with a way to present their most powerful evidence, the women who claimed they'd been conned by Victor. They created a big board with columns. On the far left were pictures of each woman, and then each of the columns had the places where Victor approached them, whether they pitched the James Bond film, the clothing he asked them to wear, and what each of these women went through. The jury was able to see this visual and notice a pattern. Each one of these women would testify. These visual aids were really important to keep all the facts in order. The hurdle was getting the prior acts admitted in court. It would make them look at the defendant as a bad person, and then they would be less likely to be impartial. But there are exceptions to this rule. And in this case, of course, both sides wanted it their way. The prosecution wanted it in, and the defense didn't. But ultimately, the similarities in the previous acts were where the exception was given. Because there were so many similarities, it wasn't like a case where the defendant was on trial for murder and the perpetrator broke in before the murder and the defendant had a history of breaking and entering. Yes, it's similar, but not enough. There are a lot of rules and exceptions. Luckily, the prior acts in this case were admissible by Judge Perry, and there were a few women who came forward with stories that were different, that happened at different malls, and those were excluded. The defense even wanted to keep Christine's roommate from testifying. Obviously, they were trying to get a bunch of things excluded. However, as I said, there were exceptions, and the defense was arguing this was hearsay when a person hears someone say something and then they're relaying it. However, the prosecution argued this was actually an exception to the rule because it showed Christine's plan, her immediate plan to go to this audition and become this Bond girl with a specific outfit, so it was allowed. In the case of the insects, the defense really wanted to rely on the age of the maggots, and the prosecution, of course, was worried about them using up all the samples and not being able to test them on their own. This is just what keeps these trials from actually happening, because all of these things beforehand. The judge decided to have both sides meet with an expert, and the expert was going to run the test in front of them. They were going to watch. It ended up that there was nothing useful that came out of it, so they didn't use it. All this trial prep took years. 43-year-old Victor Paleologus finally went to trial in July of 2006. Christine's family was in attendance. The jury was comprised of 10 men and 2 women. The prosecutor's opening statement included things about who Christine was, how she ended up at the mall, how she met Victor, and sadly, how he killed her. He went into very graphic details, showcasing pictures of the way Christine's body was found. Victor wouldn't look. Christine's parents were in tears. The prosecutor went on to tell them that they would hear from women who encountered Victor just like Christine, and that there was no phone activity on Victor's phone from 3:49 p.m. and that day until 10:06 p.m. when it did start back up. His phone pinged in Hollywood Hills, and in search of his computer with all the pictures of women in the exact outfit that he'd requested time and time again. Some were bound to chairs, others were explicit photos of women undressing while wearing one of the set items. This was part of his fantasy. The prosecutor made sure to address the lack of evidence of DNA, but it had more to do with the elements, the downpours, the decomposition, and not proof that it wasn't there. At some point, there just wasn't enough to test. But then it was the defense's turn to provide an opening argument. It was short, basically saying there was no evidence that Victor was connected to Christine. He'd never been accused of murdering anyone before, and he didn't kill her. Their trick up their sleeve was to emphasize how the valet attendant couldn't identify Victor. He was the only outside witness to have seen this man, and he couldn't conclude it was Victor. This insinuated that all these women just wanted to testify to get their 5 minutes of fame. He wanted to make it seem like they couldn't be trusted. After all, they were actors. The valet, who worked for 30 years, said the man looked like a Rambo-type character. Did Victor look like Rambo? The defense's argument was that you've got the wrong guy. They argued against the prosecution, saying DNA doesn't just not exist, but there's nothing. No semen, no saliva, no hairs, no skin, nothing. There was no evidence found in the Skyline house or any other house Victor visited. He did steal things, and that's why he told the agent to go in the other room while he screamed. He just wanted some space to steal. Good arguments, I have to say. But would they be enough? The last point the defense argued was that the body was moved, and it was moved while Victor was in jail on the BMW theft charge. Had her body been there this whole time, days and days, people in the area would have gone down there and seen it. He fails to take into account how bad the weather was. Normally, yes, people would be hiking, but for the past few days, they weren't. It had been raining. Perhaps she was more covered up before the wind and rains came pouring down, and over time, she became more visible. Remember how the death penalty was on the table? While the state had 7 women testify, each story was powerful, emotional, and unique, sharing many similarities to Christine's. Christine's family sat in the back of the courtroom, encouraging each woman when they saw they were struggling to deliver their testimonies. They would give them a thumbs up, empowering them to keep going. It was becoming increasingly clear that the defense was not getting anywhere. So guess what Victor decided to do? He opted for a plea deal in the middle of the proceedings. Remember, this was Victor's ace in every trial. Wait until the last minute, and then a Hail Mary in order to get the death penalty removed. Victor decided to plead guilty, hopefully to a lesser charge, and maybe get 10 to 12 years in prison, and cut his losses like he had done every other time. The prosecution knew they had weaknesses, so they did want to try to come up with a deal. This was 3 weeks into the trial, but they wouldn't budge. It had to be guilty on first-degree murder, not a lesser charge, and he had to give up his right to an appeal. The day came. The defense attorney told the judge his client was going to plead guilty, but he didn't want to make an open confession to court. Instead, he wanted to give a factual confession, not give details, just that he was responsible for her murder, and he would get 25 years to life, no right to an appeal. So finally, in open court with everyone present, the judge asked Victor if this was his decision to accept a plea deal, and Victor said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge asked him if he had been forced or if he made it freely, and Victor said it was his choice. The judge asked him, "Are you taking responsibility for her murder today?" Victor said, "Yes, Your Honor, I am." Then Victor's attorney said that Victor would like to make a statement, and he did. He said, "First and foremost, I've always felt from the very beginning, I know what it's like to lose somebody very close to you, and my sympathies have always gone out to the family. I just wanted to make that perfectly clear that I'm not doing this plea to upset anyone, including the family. My sympathies are with you. Second of all, I would like to acknowledge the fact that there was a tremendous amount of media attention to this issue. I don't want to get into specifics of why I've made this choice specifically, but I think there are some obvious reasons, and I would like to accept the responsibility." After this, the judge said he needed an actual plea from Victor. The judge went on to say, "On or about February 15th, 2003, you did commit the murder of Christine Johnson, and that this murder is first degree. To that charge, how do you plead?" Victor said, "Guilty, Your Honor." When Christine's father found out that Victor was able to get this plea deal, he was relieved. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but he knew that Victor would be behind bars for good, and that was enough to give Christine's father some peace of mind. Well, that was about to be put into question because at sentencing, the judge began with the news that he received an 11-page handwritten motion from Victor from his jail cell. It was a motion to withdraw his plea. Yes, he did. I found this letter. I'm not going to read it. Even though it was riddled with silly made-up words, trying to sound professional and intelligent, arguing that he was denied sufficient representation and forced into taking the plea, the judge wasn't having it. He said nope, and dismissed the motion, because you can't just withdraw your guilty plea because you changed your mind. Judge Perry went on to sentence him to 25 years to life. On reflection, we can be thankful that the other women who had the misfortune of meeting Victor didn't suffer the same fate. However, at the same time, one life was taken, and that is one too many. Christine is gone, and all her loved ones have are the memories. Every year, Kirk Johnson makes a call to the California Department of Justice to confirm that Victor remains behind bars. He's been making this call for years to ensure that he is still locked away and unable to commit any more crimes. He takes comfort in knowing that his daughter's killer is where he belongs and that the streets are safer. It may not be that much, But this simple phone call is one way that Kirk can help improve the world.